Smoke rose into the black sky. The shed behind the store was already fully ablaze. Flames climbed higher, orange and hungry. 3 riders sat motionless in the shadows, watching. Not moving. Not speaking. Who set the fire? Why tonight? While the whole town slept, a raw cry cut the dark. Doors slammed open. Buckets passed hand to hand. Water hissed on hot timber. One wrist burned red, as another pail was hauled forward. The main building still stood, scorched but whole. The shed collapsed inward, roof gone, walls blackened skeletons. The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the night. She stood alone in the smoking yard, soot on her hands, eyes fixed on the empty road, where they had vanished. A work of fiction. All characters, names, and events are invented for storytelling purposes. The sack weighed 100 pounds. Joe Caro lifted it anyway. She braced her boots wide on the porch boards, set her shoulder under the burlap, breathed once, low and even, the way she'd taught herself years ago. Not a gasp, not a grunt, just breath spent like a coin she'd already decided to part with. And rose, slow, steady, like the weight was an old argument she'd already won 100 times, and was only bothering to win it again out of habit. 3 men stood near the doorway of her store and watched her do it. Nobody moved. Nobody offered a hand. They just watched, the way men in Larkspur had always watched her. Like she was a puzzle they'd given up solving years back, and kept around now only for the view. She carried the sack to the wagon bed, set it down with a thud that rattled the boards under her boots. Didn't wipe her hands on her apron. Didn't catch her breath, not where anyone could see it. Turned around instead and looked at the 3 of them. "You planning to help?" she said. "Or you just here for the show?" Silence. A fly somewhere. The creak of the wagon settling. Old Purdy shifted his weight. Looked at his own boots like the leather had a message written on it. The Fenwick boy, 17 and already ashamed of it, opened his mouth and closed it again. Because that was Larkspur. That was the whole town folded down, into one breath, one morning, one wagon. A woman doing a man's work, while the men found something endlessly fascinating to study on the ground. Joe Caro was 23 years old, tall enough that most men looked her dead in the eye, without her having to tip her chin up to meet them. Strong enough that she had not once, not in 11 years behind, that counter, asked another soul to lift a single thing for her. Not since her mother died. Not since her father's hip started failing him one winter at a time. Not since the town decided, somewhere around her 16th year, that she was simply too much of everything a woman was supposed to be too little of. Too tall, too sharp, too loud with her numbers, too quiet with anything that might have looked like softness. Too much, full stop, the word left hanging there like nobody even needed to finish the sentence anymore. They'd finished it so many times it had worn a groove. She went back inside. The bell over the door rang behind her. Thin, tired, the same sound it had made every single morning for 11 years. Faithful as a clock nobody bothered to wind anymore, because it never once stopped ticking on its own. Behind the counter, her ledger sat open, columns marching down the page in her own careful hand. Corn here, coffee there, credit owed by half the ranches, within a day's ride, most of it never coming back, and both she and they knowing it. The store smelled the way it always did in the early hours. Coffee beans and coal oil. Cured leather from the tack hung along the back wall. Under it all, faint and sweet, the smell of the peppermint jar she kept by the register for the children, who came in with their mothers, though there were no children in her own life to spend that particular kindness on, and hadn't been for a long while, and she taught herself not to think too hard about that either. Morning light came in low and gold through the front window, laying itself across the floorboards in a long, patient stripe that moved a little farther toward the back wall, with every hour that passed. She'd watched that stripe of light cross this floor 10,000 mornings now, maybe more, and she still found something in it that steadied her, the plain, dependable fact that the sun didn't care one bit what this town said about her, and rose anyway, every single day, right on schedule. She liked numbers. Numbers didn't flinch when she got too close. Numbers didn't call her unnatural for knowing how to add a column faster than the schoolteacher who'd once taught her. She picked up her pencil, went back to work, because that was the other thing about Joe Caro, the thing the whole town missed while they were busy whispering. Whatever they said about her on the boardwalk, whatever drifted in, through the propped open door on warm afternoons, she never once stopped working. Not through the whispering, not through the pity. Working was the one thing this town had never managed to take from her. Working was hers. Old Purdy came in around 9, same as always, and paid down 40 cents on his tab in nickels he'd clearly been saving up all week for the purpose. "Morning, Joe." "Morning, Purdy." "That sack." He nodded toward the wagon, still parked out front, still loaded square. "You oughtn't do that alone." "I oughtn't have to." She counted his nickels without looking up. "But here we are." He didn't argue. He never did. That was the strange thing about Purdy. He was one of the few men in Larkspur who seemed to understand in some dim, apologetic way that his silence back on the porch had cost her something, and he never quite knew how to pay it back except in small kindnesses like not arguing with her now. "Your daddy in today?" Resting his hip. "He'll see to the ordering this afternoon." Purdy nodded. Left. The bell rang its thin little farewell behind him. Mrs. Alden came in next, needing thread and a length of oilcloth, and while Joe cut it she talked, not about Joe, for once, but about her daughter's wedding coming up in the fall. Joe let herself listen, let herself smile at the right places, because Mrs. Alden was one of the rare ones, who never once, in all the years Joe had known her, called her too much of anything. "You'll come to the wedding," Mrs. Alden said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'll come. Bring somebody if you like." Joe laughed, short, a little surprised at herself. "And who would that be exactly?" Mrs. Alden just shrugged, the way a woman shrugs, when she's decided not to say the thing she's thinking, gathered up her oilcloth and left Joe standing there, with a strange itch behind her ribs, that she chose very deliberately not to examine. Later that same hour, old Mrs. Odell came in for her weekly coffee, and sugar, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a woman who'd buried a husband young, and learned, in the years since, not to waste motion on anything that didn't need it. She didn't gossip. Never had, in all the years Joe had known her. She simply set her coins on the counter, watched Joe weigh out the sugar, with the same steady hands she always used, and said, apropos of nothing at all, "You know, my Samuel used to say a strong woman unsettles a weak man faster than anything else on this earth. Used to say it like a warning. I always heard it more like a compliment." Joe looked up from the scale. "He was a smart man, your Samuel." "He was." Mrs. Odell gathered her parcel, tucked it under one arm. "Don't let this town talk you out of what you are, Joe Caro. Lord knows it's tried on better women than you and lost every time. You keep right on being exactly what you are. Some of us are grateful for it, even if we don't say so near often enough." She left before Joe could find an answer for that, which was, Joe suspected, entirely the point, the kind of woman who gave a kindness and walked out the door before it could be handed back to her in the form of thanks she hadn't asked for. Joe stood there a moment, sugar scale still in hand, and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, the way a knot loosens when somebody finally finds the one thread that was holding the whole thing tight. By the time the sun sat straight overhead, she'd sold flour and nails and a coil of wire, and a jar of peppermints to a rancher's boy, who counted out his pennies, with the solemnity of a man closing a land deal. She'd swept the porch twice, re-stacked a shelf of canned peaches, that always seemed to end up crooked no matter how many times she squared it. And underneath all of it, quiet and constant, as a heartbeat, ran the same old current it always ran. The awareness of being watched, of being talked about, of being, in this town, less a woman than a subject, something Larkspur had been debating for 8 years now, and had never once thought to resolve by simply asking her. She remembered the schoolteacher years back, gentle as you please, telling her mother that a talent for numbers wasn't a gift a girl ought to advertise. She remembered being 15, and already taller than every boy in the county, and how the boys had stopped teasing her about it, and started, instead, going quiet whenever she walked past. Which she had learned, slowly and painfully, was worse. She remembered one Sunday in particular. A churchyard social, tables of pie, and lemonade set out under the cottonwoods, and the Reverend's nephew, a smug, well-fed boy of 17 named Cyrus, had made a wager in front of half the congregation. $1 says a girl can't figure how many bushels that wagon'll carry before the axle gives. She'd looked at the wagon, looked at the load already stacked on it, done the sum in her head faster than Cyrus could find his own pencil. 41, she'd said. 42 and you'll hear the axle, before you see it crack. Cyrus had laughed, bet his dollar loud enough for everyone to hear, and they'd loaded it 38, 39, 40, the whole churchyard gathering to watch, the way a churchyard gathers to watch anything that promises to end in somebody's embarrassment. At 41, the axle had groaned. At 42, it had cracked clean through, dropping a sack of flour into the dirt in a soft white cloud that drifted over half the pie table. Cyrus paid his dollar, red to the ears, and Joe had stood there, 13 years old, and correct in front of the entire congregation, waiting for anyone to say well done. Nobody did. The silence that followed had a shape to it. A weight. She hadn't understood it then, not fully, only that something about being right in that particular way in front of that particular crowd had cost her something she couldn't name and never quite got back. It was years before she understood the shape of it. That a girl who could outfigure a preacher's nephew in front of God, and everybody was not admired for it. She was catalogued, filed away under a heading the town had already half written, before she ever opened her mouth. She remembered her mother's voice most of all, soft with worry, the year before the fever took her. They'd been folding linens together, and Joe had said something about not much caring whether the Talbot boy ever came calling again, and her mother had gone quiet in that particular way she had, the way that meant something true was about to follow. "We'll have to hope for a kind man, Joe," her mother had said, "because you'll make it hard on yourself otherwise." Joe had never quite forgiven that sentence. Not because it was cruel, because it wasn't, because it had been said with love, real love, her mother's hands still warm on the linen between them, and love was supposed to be the thing that didn't ask you to be smaller than you already were. Love was supposed to be the one place in the whole world where a person didn't have to apologize for the size of themselves. It had taken her mother's death, 2 winters later, to teach her the rest of it. That the town's pity for a motherless girl, who could out-argue the Reverend's nephew was, if anything, worse than its scorn. Pity had a way of settling in, and never quite leaving the way damp settles into a cellar. Poor Thomas Caro, they said, for years afterward. That girl of his, sharp as a knife and twice as cold. No wonder no man will have her. She'd learned to walk through that particular sentence the way she walked through weather. Head down, shoulders set, get where you're going. She shook the thought off, went back to the counter, because the past didn't pay down anybody's tab, and there was a ledger that did. The bell rang again a little after 2. Joe didn't look up right away, didn't need to. She knew the weight of every regular customer's step by now, knew Purdy by his cane, knew the Fenwick boy by the way he always ran the last 3 steps like the floor might close up behind him, if he didn't hurry. This step she didn't know, slow, even, unbothered, the step of a man who wasn't in any particular hurry and didn't much care who noticed that he wasn't. She looked up. A stranger stood just inside the door, dust still riding the shoulders of his coat. The kind of dust that only settles into cloth after weeks on a trail, not days. He was tall, taller than her, which almost never happened, and she felt the old flicker of surprise before she managed to smother it. His hat sat pushed back just enough to show a pair of eyes that had clearly done a great deal of looking over a great many years and not much talking to go with it. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon. I'm needing feed for a horse that's earned itself a rest. 20 pounds of oats if you've got clean ones. 10 of cracked corn besides." "We've got clean ones." She came around the counter, scooped by feel the way she always did, corn first, then oats, set the sack on the scale without ceremony, without checking twice, because she'd never once needed to. 20 pounds, dead on. The stranger noticed. She saw him notice, the small shift in his face, subtle as a card turning over, the kind of attention most men in this town had never once bothered to spend on her. You run this place alone? He asked. There it was. The question. She felt her spine straighten before she'd even decided to let it. You got a problem with that? No, ma'am. He said it plain. No hedge under it, no smirk riding along behind it. I asked because a place this clean, run this tight, usually takes 3 men who don't half care about it. You're doing it with 2 hands. And you're doing it better than they would. Joe stopped scooping the corn. Just for a second. Just long enough that she was annoyed at herself for it afterward. Because nobody said things like that to her. Nobody. Not in 11 years behind this counter had a man walked through that door and looked at her work instead of her size, her height, the unnatural fact of a woman who could lift what she lifted and add what she added. She caught herself before it showed on her face, tied off the sack, named her price flat and businesslike the way she named every price. That's $1.10 for the oats, 40 cents on the corn. He counted it out without arguing, without trying to talk her down the way half her customers did on principle just to see if it worked. Name's Nate Ashford. Didn't ask. No, he agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. Didn't quite become a smile. You didn't. He hefted the sacks, both of them, one under each arm, easy as breathing, and carried them out to a gelding tied at the rail. And Joe Caro stood behind her own counter, in her own store, and did something she hadn't done in longer than she cared to admit. She wondered about a man. After he'd already walked out the door, she caught herself doing it. Stopped it cold, the way she stopped a runaway cart with a boot to the wheel. Because wondering never paid down anybody's tab either. Wondering was a soft animal, and Larkspur had taught her a long time ago, thoroughly and repeatedly, exactly what happened to soft animals that wandered too far from the fence. She went back to her ledger, underlined a number that didn't need underlining. He took a room above the silver rail, came down for supper because a man had to eat, and a saloon at supper time he'd learned in 12 years on the trail was where a town kept its opinions, set out on the bar like dishes nobody had asked for, free to any man willing to sit still long enough. He hadn't had his elbows down 3 minutes before somebody slid onto the stool beside him, friendly as a salesman, and set a beer in front of him he hadn't asked for. New in town, round face, good coat, better than most in a room like this. The kind of smile that had never once had to work for anything in its life. Harlan Voss. Ashford. Saw you tie up at the feed store today. I did. Word of advice. Friend to friend. Harlan leaned in, dropped his voice into that low, confidential register men use right before they hand you poison and call it a gift. That woman that runs it. Joe Caro. You'll want to steer clear. Nate drank his beer. Didn't answer right away. Silence pulled more truth out of a man than any question ever had, and he'd learned that a long time ago on a lot of ground a long way from here. Why's that? Oh. Harlan searched for the word, and Nate watched him search for it, watched him reach up onto a shelf he clearly kept it on, worn smooth from handling. She's too much. You understand. Too much for any man to handle. Sharp-tongued. Thinks she's smarter than everybody. And the hell of it is, half the time she is. And there's nothing a man can stand less than that. He shook his head, sorrowful as a preacher. Ran off every decent fella that ever looked her way. There was a man from over in Millbrook came courting proper a few years back. She made him feel 2 inches tall inside a month. Gone by spring. She'll do the same to you. That's so. That's so. Harlan sat back, pleased with himself, like he'd just done a Christian duty, and wanted somebody to notice. Sad thing. Old Thomas Caro girl. But some women just weren't built to be handled. Nate set his glass down. Slow. Careful. Let me ask you something. He turned on the stool, faced Harlan full on. This afternoon I bought 30 pounds of feed off that woman. She scooped it by eye. Hit the scale dead on both times, first try. You know how many men I've watched do that in 12 years of buying feed? Harlan didn't answer. 2, Nate said. And they'd both been doing it 40 years. He leaned forward, elbows on the bar. So I don't rightly know what you mean by too much. Seems to me she's exactly enough. Seems to me maybe the men around here just kept coming up short and needed somewhere to set the blame that wasn't themselves. The bar had gone a shade quieter. A card game 2 tables back had stopped dealing. Harlan's smile did something ugly and slow, like a door swinging shut in no particular hurry. "You don't know her," he said. "No," Nate agreed. "I don't. But I know I didn't ride 600 miles looking for a town that'd make me comfortable. I came looking for something real." He stood, dropped a coin on the bar for the beer he hadn't wanted. "And a woman who loads a wagon square and reads a scale by eye, mister. That's about the realest thing I've seen since I left home." He walked out. Behind him, the silver rail buzzed like a kicked hive. And every word of it would be sitting on somebody's tongue by morning, ready to carry to the one place it would land hardest, because that was the one thing this town could never do quietly. It could not keep a kindness any better than it kept a cruelty. It carried both the same way, fast and a little bent out of shape by the carrying. One man at the bar hadn't said a word through any of it. Reverend Amos Whitfield sat near the far end, a cold cup of coffee in front of him instead of the whiskey the rest of the room favored, and he'd watched the whole exchange the way he watched most things in Larkspur, quietly and with a patience that made people forget, sometimes, how closely he was actually paying attention. He didn't know Nate Ashford. Didn't know, yet, what to make of a stranger willing to plant himself in the middle of a fight that wasn't his. But he'd known Jo Caro since she was small enough to sit on her mother's lap during his sermons, and he'd watched this town do to her, slowly, over years, the particular cruelty it reserved for anyone who refused to shrink to fit the space provided. He said nothing that night, only watched the stranger walk out and turned his cold coffee once in its cup and thought, though he would not have said it aloud to a living soul, that it was about time somebody in this town said out loud what he himself had believed quietly for years and never once found the courage to preach from his own pulpit. He walked the long way back to the boarding house, past the dark windows of the feed store, past the church, out to where the road gave up being a street, and just became prairie again, dark and enormous and entirely unbothered by the opinions of small towns. He didn't think about the beer, or Harlan Voss's smile, or the card game that had gone quiet behind him. He thought about a scale. 20 pounds, dead on, first try. He thought about a woman he'd known for the length of one transaction, who had already lodged herself somewhere behind his ribs the way certain places did, certain mornings did, the way a piece of ground could simply feel like the one you'd been walking toward the whole time, without knowing it. He didn't examine that too closely either. 12 years on the trail had taught him plenty about not examining a thing before you were ready for what you'd find. He turned back toward the boarding house. The lamp in his window was the only one still burning on that whole stretch of street. He came down for breakfast before the sun had cleared the ridge, because 12 years of trail habit didn't care what town he happened to be sleeping in. Mrs. Fenwick, who ran the boarding house, and half its gossip besides, set a plate in front of him without being asked twice. "You're the one made a speech at the Silver Rail," she said. "Not unkindly, just stating a fact the way you'd state the weather. Wasn't much of a speech. Wasn't much of anything else being talked about this morning either." She refilled his coffee, studied him a moment, the way older women in small towns had a habit of studying men they hadn't yet decided about. "You know her? The Caro girl? Bought some oats off her." "That's not what I asked." Nate didn't answer right away. Turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, the way another man might turn a hat. "No," he said finally. "Don't know her. Not yet. Mrs. Fenwick set the coffee pot down. "Well, she's a good woman, whatever this town says about her. Kept that store running clean, through her mother's dying, and her father's failing both, and never once asked for a nickel of pity while she did it. Town's not always kind to women who don't ask." "No," Nate said. "I don't imagine it is." He ate in silence after that, and Mrs. Fenwick let him, and if his mind wandered somewhere back down a different road, a different town, a different family, a debt that had cost people he loved everything they had, while the men responsible for it kept their good coats and their Sunday smiles, he didn't let it show on his face. He'd buried that road a long time ago, or told himself he had. But sitting in a strange boarding house in a strange town, watching a plate of eggs go cold in front of him, because his mind kept drifting back to a woman who scooped feed by eye and hit the scale dead on every single time. He found the old ground wasn't nearly as buried as he'd believed. He finished his coffee, went to see about his horse. By the next morning, half of Larkspur had heard some version of what happened at the Silver Rail, and most of what they'd heard was already bent a little out of true, the way these things always were by the time they finished traveling, picking up small embellishments at every porch it passed, like burrs on a wool skirt. At the livery, two ranch hands argued over whether Ashford had actually threatened to shoot Harlan Voss, or only implied it, and settled eventually on a version where he'd done both. At the church steps, old Mrs. Yarnell told anyone who'd stand still long enough that she'd always said the Caro girl would come to a bad end one way or another, though she was notably vague when pressed on what the bad end in question was supposed to be, given that nothing bad had actually happened yet. Mabel Pruitt heard it first and heard it worst, though. She ran the dry goods next door to Joe's store and had made a life's work out of other people's business, and she wore that work like a Sunday hat, proud of it and a little too large for her. She came into the Caro store under the pretense of borrowing a scoop of nails. "Heard you got yourself an admirer," Mabel said, eyes glittering. Joe kept her hands moving in the drawer. "Don't know what you mean. That drifter, Ashford, made a whole scene at the Silver Rail last night, defending your honor to Harlan Voss in front of half the town." "I don't have honor that needs defending, Mabel." "Well." Mabel let it hang, the way she always did, that little cruelty dressed up neat as concern. "He knows you now, or thinks he does. My advice, a man like that drifting through sweet talking, he'll say what he needs to say and be gone by first frost. You know that better than most, honey. After the last one." There it was. After the last one. The Millbrook man. The one who'd come courting proper and stayed a month and left and let the whole county believe it was because Joe was too cold, too proud, too much. The truth Joe had never told a living soul, was that he'd wanted her to sign her store into his name before the wedding, and she'd said no. And that was the thing he couldn't forgive. Not her spine, her account book. But you couldn't say that in Larkspur. In Larkspur, a woman who chose her own store over a husband wasn't a woman with sense. She was a warning, told and retold at every quilting circle and church supper for years, long after the details had worn smooth and only the moral remained. "Anyway," Mabel said, and left, having gotten exactly what she came for. Joe stood there a long moment after the bell went still. Then she did something she hated herself for. She walked to the window, looked down toward the Silver Rail, though there was nothing to see from here but the same dusty stretch of street there always was. Caught herself doing it. Stepped back from the glass like it had burned her. "Don't," she told herself. "Don't you dare. You've got a store to run, and a father whose hip is worse every week, and absolutely no time in this world for a stranger who'll be gone by the first hard frost." But under that, quieter, in a voice she'd spent years teaching herself to ignore, he said exactly enough. Nobody had ever said that to her. Not once. Not her father, who loved her and pitied her in the same breath, and had never once managed to tell the two apart. Not the Millbrook man. Not even her own mother, who'd looked at her tall, growing daughter with worry in her eyes, and hoped out loud for a kind man, because Joe would make it hard otherwise. Exactly enough. She went back to the drawer, counted the nails twice, though she never needed to count anything twice. But the number in her head had 2 extra words riding along beside it now, and she found she could not seem to put them down, no matter how many times she tried. Her father came in a little before noon, moving slower than he used to, leaning on a cane he was still too proud to admit he needed most days. Thomas Caro had signed the store over to Joe 3 years back. His idea, at the time, a way, he'd said, to keep the taxmen and the creditors off a sick old man's estate, if anything ever happened to him. But everyone in Larkspur, including Thomas himself most days, still talked about the place like it was his. He lowered himself onto the stool by the stove, the same stool he'd sat on every noon for 11 years, and today he did it wrong. Too slow, too careful, like his own bones had turned into something that needed apologizing to. "Papa," Joe. He didn't look at her right away. Sit down a minute. I've got flour to weigh out. The flour will keep. His voice cracked on that last word. And that was the thing that stopped her cold, because her father's voice did not crack. Not the day her mother died. Not once in 11 years behind this counter had she heard it do what it had just done. She set down the scoop, came around the counter, stood in front of him with her arms folded, and felt the floor of her stomach drop clean away before he'd said another single word. How much? She said. Just tell me the number, Papa. It ain't just money, Joe. How much? Thomas Caro pressed the heel of his hand against one eye, hard, like he could push the whole conversation back inside himself, if he just pressed hard enough. 4 years back, he said, before the store went to your name, I was behind, real behind. Drought took the wheat 2 seasons running, and the bank down in Millbrook was fixing to take the land, the house, everything we had, Joe, gone in a single spring. You never told me. I never told you, because I signed a note. He looked up at her now, and his eyes were wet, and old and terrible in a way she had genuinely never once seen them. Silas Voss, he said, Harlan's father. Before he passed, he covered it, paid the bank direct, kept us in our home, when nobody else in this county would have lifted a finger. His hands had started shaking, and he pressed them flat against his own knees like he could still them by force. But it wasn't a gift, Joe. It was a note, $700. A note that said, if I ever couldn't pay it back, Silas had claim. Not just to the money, to the land, the store, all of it. The stove ticked in the silence between them. Somewhere outside, a wagon rolled past, ordinary and unbothered, wheels grinding over the same ruts they ground, over every day of the world, indifferent to the fact that a family's whole life was quietly coming apart inside four walls not 30 feet away. The store's mine, Joe said, quiet. On paper. You signed it over to me 3 years ago. I signed over what I had. His voice broke again, worse this time. But you can't give away what you already owed on, Joe. That note came first. It's older than the deed. It's older than any paper with your name on it. Wait. Joe held up a hand, steadying herself against the counter, with the other. You've been paying on this note. All this time, where has it been going, Papa? The money. I keep the books. I'd have seen a payment that size leave this store. I've been paying Silas direct, in cash out of what little I had left over from before the store went to your name, savings mostly, and what your mother left behind. Thomas's shoulders sagged further, if that was even possible, like a man settling slowly into the ground. Silas never wanted it run through any bank ledger. Said it was a matter between families, not business for strangers to see. I thought that was kindness at the time. Now I wonder if it wasn't just a way of making sure there'd never be a proper record of any of it. Nothing but his word, and mine, and whatever his son decides to remember. And has Harlan seen this note? The actual paper? I don't rightly know if there ever was much of a paper to begin with, beyond what Silas and I signed that one afternoon. I never kept a copy myself. Foolish, I know that now. I trusted the man, Joe. Trusted him the way you trust a neighbor who's fed your family through a hard winter. He looked up at her, and his eyes were an old man's eyes, tired past the point tiredness usually reached. I never once imagined his son would be the one collecting. How much time? She said. Her own voice had gone very quiet now, very level, the voice she used when a customer tried to shortchange her, and she needed him to understand, without any shouting at all, that it would not be happening. Papa, how much time do we have? Harlan's calling it in. 20 days. Joe did not sit down. Her legs told her to. She refused them. She went and got a piece of butcher paper and a pencil because numbers were the one language in the whole world that had never once lied to her, and she started writing. $60 in the strongbox. 40 more owed to her around the county, most of it from folks who would never pay it, and both she and they knew it and had known it for years, the way you know a debt has quietly become a kind of charity nobody bothers naming out loud. The store cleared maybe $20 a month once the stock was paid for, and the shelves restocked. Even if she starved. Even if she never bought a new dress, or a warm meal, or a single solitary thing for herself for 2 solid years. There was no way to scratch $700 out of Larkspur in 20 days, or in 20 months, or in any stretch of time that mattered. "Joe," her father said behind her. "I'm sorry." "God, I am so sorry." "Don't." Came out harder than she meant it to. She softened it, best she could manage. "Don't, Papa. You kept a roof over us when nobody else would've. You did what a man does." She kept writing anyway, though the numbers weren't adding up to anything, but a wall tall and blank, and getting taller the longer she stared at it. Because here was the thing sitting under all of it, the thing she would not say out loud with her father in the room, not for anything. This is what they've all been waiting for. Every soul in Larkspur who'd ever called her too much, too proud, too tall, too sharp. They were about to get to watch her lose the one thing in this world that was hers. And they would shake their heads, say what a shame it was. A real shame. But what could you expect, really? A store's no place for a woman anyhow. Some things a man just handles better. She pressed the pencil down, so hard the tip snapped clean off in her hand. She sat there a moment, looking at the broken lead. Then she got up, found another pencil, started again, because that, too, was Joe Caro. Whatever broke in her hands, she picked up another one and kept writing. Her father left, before dark, too tired and too ashamed to stay for supper, and Joe closed the store alone. Swept the floor twice, though it hadn't needed it the first time. Squared the shelves, even the peaches, even though nobody but her would ever notice if they sat crooked overnight. She meant to go straight to bed. She found herself instead at the front window, in the dark, with the lamp turned low, looking out at a street that had already gone quiet for the evening. 20 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed, and couldn't work back up. She turned it over, looked at it from every angle a person could look at a number from, the way she'd been taught to look at every number, since she was old enough to hold a pencil. There was no angle that made it smaller. And underneath the number, quieter, uninvited, came the other thought, the one she'd been fighting off, since the Silver Rails gossip reached her that morning. He said exactly enough. "Don't," she told herself. "Don't you dare. You have 20 days and a debt the size of a mountain, and that is the whole of your business tonight, and none of it, not one part of it, has anything to do with a stranger's opinion of how you scoop oats." She almost believed it. She stepped back from the glass, turned the lamp down the rest of the way. She did not sleep well. He came back the next afternoon. Not for feed this time. His gelding had eaten well enough the day before to last a week, but he came in anyway, and bought a tin of coffee he likely didn't need, and lingered a moment longer than the purchase required. "You're still here," Joe said. Not unkindly. Just an observation, the way she might have remarked on weather. "Horse likes the grazing east of town. Figured I'd stay another day or two. See what there is to see." Not much to see in Larkspur. Depends what a man's looking for. He set his coin on the counter. Didn't reach for the coffee right away. "Heard some talk this morning. About last night at the Silver Rail." Joe's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I'm sure you did." "Wasn't looking for thanks?" Nate said, quick, before she could build the wall any higher than it already stood. "Didn't say it to be thanked for it. Said it because it was true, and because a man who watches a lie get told, and says nothing might as well have told it himself." She looked at him a long moment. Something in her chest, unfamiliar and slightly alarming, refused to settle back down where she'd left it. Most men who ride into a town they've never seen before don't go picking fights over women they've known one afternoon, she said. "No," he agreed. "Most don't. So why?" He picked up his coffee tin, turned it once in his hand, the same careful way he'd turned the can of peaches, like everything he touched deserved a moment's consideration, before he decided what to do with it. "Guess I've never been much good at watching something get taken. That shouldn't be," he said. "Learned that the hard way a long time back. Costs a man something watching that and doing nothing. Costs more than most folks think it does." There was a weight behind the words that Joe couldn't quite name, a door left just slightly ajar on something old and unhealed, and she found herself wanting, against every instinct that had kept her upright these 8 years, to ask what was behind it. She didn't. Not yet. It wasn't her question to ask, not on a second meeting, and she had learned long ago not to go reaching for doors that weren't hers to open. "Well," she said instead, "enjoy your coffee, Mr. Ashford." "Nate! Enjoy your coffee, Nate." He almost smiled at that, the closest she'd seen him come to it yet, and touched the brim of his hat, and left her standing there behind her counter, with a tin of coffee sold, and a strange, stubborn warmth sitting, where the cold arithmetic of $700 had been sitting only a day before. It didn't last. The arithmetic came back the way arithmetic always did. But for the length of one small conversation about coffee, it had gone quiet, and Joe found she'd missed the quiet more than she wanted to admit, even to herself, even alone. The days that followed passed the way days do, when a person is waiting for something they dread, and cannot hurry along. She opened the store each morning at the same hour, swept the same porch, weighed the same flour, counted the same coins, nodded to the same customers who came in needing thread or nails or coffee, and had no notion, most of them, of the number sitting behind her ribs like a held breath. 20 days, -1, -2, -3. She caught herself doing arithmetic she hadn't asked her mind to do, how many hours of daylight were left in a given afternoon, translated automatically into how many hours of daylight remained total before Harlan Voss's deadline arrived. She hated that her mind had started doing it without permission, hated it and could not stop it. Nate came by twice more in those days, once for nothing at all or nothing he named outright. He bought a spool of wire he plainly didn't need, and asked after her father's hip, and she found herself telling him more than she'd meant to about the years, since her mother died, the long, slow work of holding a store and a household together with 2 hands that were never quite enough hands, no matter how strong they were. He listened the way few people in this town ever had, not waiting for his turn to talk, just listening like the story itself mattered to him, and not merely his place in it. The second time, he didn't buy anything at all, just leaned in the doorway a moment, hat in hand, and said, "You look tired, Miss Caro." "I am tired." 20 days getting shorter? 16 now. She said it flat, the way she said every number, though this one cost her more than any sum she'd ever entered in her ledger. "Feels shorter than that, some mornings." He hadn't offered anything more that day, hadn't pushed, just nodded, like her tiredness was a fact worth respecting rather than a problem waiting for him to solve it, and left her wondering again, despite every effort not to, what exactly it was about this particular stranger that made silence feel less like an absence and more like company. By the 4th morning, the strongbox held $61. The wall in her arithmetic stood exactly, as tall as it had the day her father first said the number 700 out loud, and no amount of careful sweeping or squared shelves had made it 1 inch shorter. She did not know, that morning, opening the store the way she opened it every morning, that Harlan Voss was already saddling his horse across town. Done, entirely, finally done, with waiting even the little while he'd promised. Harlan Voss did not wait 20 days. That was the thing about men who'd spent their whole lives being told they were owed something. They could not stand to actually wait for it. He came to the store on the 4th day, a little past 10 in the morning, and he did not come alone. He brought his cousin Roy, thin, quick-eyed, the kind of man who laughed a half-second after everyone else, so nobody would notice he hadn't understood the joke, and a hired hand named Pute, broad-shouldered and silent, who spent the whole visit studying his own boots like they held some private scripture written just for him. They came in the way men walk, into a place they've already decided belongs to them. Not customers, surveyors. Harlan walked the aisles slow, unhurried, trailing one hand along shelves Joe scrubbed down every single night before she locked up. "Real nice place," he said. "You keep it real nice, Joe. I'll give you that much. You want to buy something, Harlan? Or you just here to pet my counter like a horse you're fixing to steal?" "See," he turned to Roy, delighted. "That mouth. You believe a man's supposed to just live with that his whole life?" Roy smirked, right on cue. Pute kept studying his boots. Harlan came up to the counter, leaned on it, close and dropped his voice into something meant just for her. "Here's how it's going to go," he said. "That note your daddy signed, comes due end of the month, is what I told him. But I'll be honest with you, Joe, since we're being neighborly about all this. I don't much feel like waiting for days," Joe said. "That's what's passed, since you told my father 20. You want to shorten it now, too?" "I've reconsidered." His smile widened, slow and terrible, the kind of smile a man wears when he already knows how the whole conversation is going to end and is simply enjoying the walk there. "See, there's the easy way here, and there's the hard way. Easy way, you sign the store over quiet. No lawyer, no fuss on the courthouse steps. I let you and your daddy stay on in the house. Might even keep you working the counter for me. Come to think of it." His eyes traveled over her, slow, unhurried, like she was already something he owned and simply hadn't collected yet. "Woman like you running my store, taking my orders instead of giving them. There's a kind of justice in that, kind I believe I'd enjoy for a good long while." Everything in Joe went cold and very, very clear. "And the hard way," she said. "The hard way." Harlan straightened up off the counter, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something colder now than the greed she'd already braced herself for. "The hard way is I ride over to Sheriff Colby's office this afternoon and have a word with him. Tell him what I know, that your daddy's deed on this land don't square with what's filed down in Millbrook, that there's a question of forgery hanging over Thomas Caro's name, that maybe nobody's bothered looking into too closely yet." The store went very, very quiet. "That's a lie," Joe said. Her voice did not shake. She would be proud of that later, that it did not shake. "My father has never forged a single thing in his entire life." "Don't much matter what's true, Joe." Harlan said it easy, almost gently, the way you'd explain something obvious to a child too slow to see it on her own. "Matters what Sheriff Colby chooses to believe, when I'm the one doing the telling, and you're the one with no lawyer, no money, and a store you're about to lose anyhow. Man in Colby's position, he's got to think about who he'll still need to do business with next year. And it surely won't be you." "You'd send my father to a cell," Joe said, slow, like she was testing whether the words could even fit in her mouth, "over a lie you made up yourself, so you could take a store you already know isn't rightfully yours to take." "I'd call it persuasion." Harlan shrugged, easy as breathing, like the difference had never once occurred to him, and didn't much interest him now that it had. "You want to call it something uglier, that's your privilege. Don't change what happens next. Think," Joe told herself. "Don't shout. Shouting is what he wants. Shouting is what the whole town expects, and you are not going to be the thing they expected today. Not in your own store, not in front of Roy Voss's smirking face." "I heard you made a friend at the Silver Rail last night," Roy put in, unable to help himself, the way he never could when he thought he'd found an opening. "That drifter. Wouldn't get too attached, Joe. Cousin Harlan's got a way of running off anybody who tries standing too close to what's his." "I'm not his," Joe said. "And neither is this store. Not yet." "Not yet," Harlan agreed, pleasant as ever, like she'd said something clever instead of something that cost her more than he'd ever know to swing all the way through. "Give it time." He tipped his hat, pleasant as a Sunday visit. "So you think on that. 20 days on the note, if you want to keep pretending there's still 20 days left to think in. But I'd start being real friendly toward the easy way, was I you." He turned for the door, stopped, turned back, like he'd nearly forgotten something small and pleasant. "Because the hard way doesn't just cost you the store, Joe. Costs you your daddy too. And I don't believe you've got the stomach to watch that happen. Not when there's an easier road sitting right there in front of you, plain as day." He and his men filed out. Roy knocked a can of peaches off the shelf on his way past, on purpose, deliberate as a signature, and left it rolling across the floorboards behind him. Joe stood behind her counter until the bell went completely still. Then she came around, picked up the can, and set it back on the shelf, square. Even with the others, her hands were shaking, just slightly, just enough that she noticed and hated herself for noticing, and set the can down twice to get it perfectly straight. because it was the one thing in that entire moment she could still control. Because if she was going to lose this place, she decided, standing there with her hands still on the tin, she was going to keep it perfect right up, until the very last hour it belonged to her. Not one shelf crooked, not one can out of line. Let them come and take a store that had never once, not for a single day, looked like it belonged to somebody who was losing. That's when she noticed the man standing in the doorway. He'd seen the whole of it. She could tell by his face. Nate Ashford, just inside the door, where the bell must have rung under Harlan's exit, and she'd been too rattled by then to hear it at all. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough." He came in a few steps, careful, the way a man walks toward something he isn't entirely sure wants him any closer. "You want me to pretend I didn't hear it? I will if that's what you need. But I don't much think you're the kind of woman who wants pretending. I don't need your help. Didn't say you did." He set his hat down on the counter gently, the way you'd set something down that might still be listening. "But I just heard a man threaten to put your father in a cell over a lie so he could take everything you've got, without ever once having to fight for it fair. And I'll tell you plain, Miss Caro, I have killed less time over less cause than that." He said it quiet, not a boast. Just a fact, laid out on the counter between them the same unhurried way he'd laid down his coins for the oats 2 days before. "So, you don't need my help. Fine." He looked at her, steady, and there was nothing in his face of this town, none of the pity, none of the sport, none of the too much, that had followed her around for 8 straight years like a shadow that had learned to talk. "But I'd take it kindly if you'd let me stand here another minute. Instead of walking back out into a street full of folks who I expect think what just happened is funny." And Joe Caro, who had not let a single soul see under her guard in more years than she cared to count, who had turned kindness away at her own door, so many times it had finally, mercifully, stopped bothering to knock, felt something in her chest come loose, just slightly, just enough that she noticed it happening, and could not, for once, stop it. $700, she heard herself say, because it came out of her now in a rush, like water finally finding the crack it had been looking for all along. "That's the note. My father signed it 4 years ago to save the land, and I never once knew about it until 3 days back. Harlan's calling it in, used to be 20 days, now it's whatever he decides it is when he walks through that door, and if I don't sign it, over quiet he says he's going to Sheriff Colby with some story about forged papers. My father has never forged a thing in his entire life. And it won't matter one bit, because Harlan's got money, and a smile the whole town trusts, and I've got a can of peaches, and a pencil I've already broken once this week." She stopped, caught her breath, finally, the one she'd been holding, since Harlan first leaned on her counter. "So there's your real thing, Cowboy. There's the woman everybody in this town is so eager to watch fall. She's about to fall, and she cannot stop it, and she is going to keep this store perfect, every last shelf of it, right up until the hour they carry it out, from under her." Nate was quiet a long moment. He picked up the can of peaches she'd just reshelved, turned it once in his hand, set it back down, exactly where she'd put it, with a care that struck her as strange in a man his size. She noticed that, God help her, she noticed everything about him. "Can I sit?" he said, not a demand. He nodded toward the stool by the stove, her father's stool, though he had no way of knowing that. "Been on my feet since dawn. And I think you and I are about to have a long conversation, Miss Caro, and I'd rather have it sitting down." "About what?" "About $700. He pulled the stool out, settled onto it easy, like he had all the time left in the world to spend. Like the arithmetic that had just beaten her flat that morning was one more trail he'd already walked before, more than once, and come out the other side of. And about a man who's real eager to take something, without ever once having to show anybody the paper he claims he's taking it on. Joe looked at him, looked toward the door Harlan had just walked out of. Looked, despite every good reason not to, at the small stubborn hope trying to stand itself back up somewhere behind her ribs, the one she'd stepped away from a dark window to smother the night before. "I don't know you," she said. "No," Nate agreed. You don't. So why? Why does any of this matter to a man who's been in this town 4 days? He turned his hat once more in his hands. Set it down again, final this time, like he'd decided something. Because I've spent 12 years on the trail, he said. Watching men take things off other men just because the law let them or the town let them, or nobody in either direction cared enough to stop it. Watched it so many times I stopped bothering to count. Something moved behind his eyes, brief, unfinished, a door he didn't open all the way. Watched it happen to my own family once, a long time back. Never got to be on the side that made it right that time. Not once. He looked up at her. There was nothing soft in it. Nothing that asked for a single thing back in return. Figure it's about time I was. Joe studied him, the dust still riding his coat, the steadiness in his hands, the kind that didn't come from a man who'd never had to fight for anything. She thought of Sheriff Colby and the 20 days that were already down to 16, and a father whose voice had cracked for the first time in 11 years. She thought of the word exactly, and the word enough, and how long she had gone without hearing either one, and how dangerous it felt to want to hear them again. I haven't said yes to anything, she said. Didn't ask you to. Nate stood, picked his hat back up, didn't put it on. Just said I'd stand here a minute. I've stood it. I'll be at the boarding house if you decide you want the rest of the conversation. He walked to the door, stopped, hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Not the way Harlan had looked at her, like something already owned. The other way. The way, she realized with a small cold jolt, nobody in 8 years had ever quite managed to look at her at all. For what it's worth, Miss Caro, he said, I don't believe for 1 minute you're too much of anything. I believe this whole town's just been too small to stand next to you, and never once had the grace to say so. The bell rang once, thin and ordinary, as the door closed behind him. Joe stood alone in the store while after that. Long enough for the light through the front window to shift a full hand's width across the floor. Because she had never once, not in 11 years, needed anybody to stand in her doorway and tell her what she was. And here was a stranger doing exactly that, unasked, and some stubborn, exhausted part of her wanted, more than she could easily forgive herself for, to believe him. She didn't go to the boarding house. Not that day. She went to see Sheriff Colby instead. Because Joe Caro did not build her defenses on the word of a man she'd known 4 days. However steady his hands looked, she built them on facts. And if Harlan Voss meant to use the law as a club, she intended to know exactly how heavy that club really was before anyone swung it. Sheriff Colby's office sat at the far end of Larkspur's one real street, a squat brick building that had once been a bank and still smelled faintly of the vault it used to guard. Colby himself was a heavy-set man somewhere past 50, with a mustache gone gray years before the rest of him, and a habit of studying his own desk when a conversation turned uncomfortable. He was studying it now. Sheriff. Joe didn't sit. I understand Harlan Voss came to see you. Colby's eyes flicked up, then back down. Man's got a right to bring a concern to the law, Miss Caro. Does the concern have anything behind it? Now, I didn't say. Does it, Sheriff? He was quiet a moment, long enough that Joe understood with a cold settling certainty that the answer was no, and that he was going to say something else anyway. Say it, she thought. Whatever it is you're about to dress up as reasonable, just say it plain and let me hate you for it clean instead of dragging it out while you study that desk like it's going to answer for you. I'll say this. Colby folded his hands on the desk, the posture of a man choosing every word like it might be quoted back to him later. Harlan Voss's family has done a fair piece of business in this county. Bank loans, cattle contracts. Half the ranchers hereabouts owe him something one way or another, and I expect to keep working with all of them for a good many years yet. I'm not saying your daddy did anything wrong, Miss Caro. I'm saying I can't afford to make an enemy of Harlan Voss over a claim I haven't had cause to look into proper. So you'll look into it, if he asks you to. If he asks me to, I'll have to, even though you just told me you don't believe it. I didn't say that either, but he wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it, and Joe had spent 11 years reading men across a counter, learning the particular shape a lie made in a jaw, in a pair of shoulders, in the way a man's hands went suddenly very interested in a stack of paper that didn't need straightening. She'd gotten what she came for. Not comfort. Confirmation. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff," she said, and left before he could offer her anything, as thin and useless as an apology. Outside, the afternoon sun sat high and indifferent over Larkspur's one real street, and Joe stood on the steps of the old bank building a moment, letting the size of what she'd just learned settle into her properly. The law would not save her. Not because the law was against her, Colby hadn't said that, not outright, but because the law in a town this small belonged, in practice if not on paper, to whoever the town needed most to keep doing business with. And that man was not Thomas Caro. It had never once in 11 years been Thomas Caro. She untied her horse, swung up into the saddle, and rode for her father's place with that particular kind of clarity that comes only after the last soft hope in a situation has been quietly, thoroughly extinguished, the clarity of a woman who finally understands, without any more room left for doubting it, that if this was going to be fixed at all, she alone was going to have to be the one who fixed it. She rode out to her father's place on the edge of town before supper, because the thought of him sitting alone, with what he'd told her, that morning was worse, somehow, than anything Harlan Voss had said in her own store. She found him on the porch in the failing light, not doing anything at all, just sitting, hands folded in his lap, watching the horizon like it owed him an answer it hadn't yet paid. "Papa." "Joe." He didn't turn. "Sheriff tell you what you wanted to hear?" "He told me what I needed to hear. Not the same thing." Thomas nodded slowly, like that was about what he'd expected. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the day I signed that note. Silas Voss sitting across from me at his own kitchen table, kind as you please, telling me not to worry, that a note between neighbors wasn't the same as a note with a bank. Man looked me dead in the eye and told me family didn't call in family." His hands tightened in his lap. "I believed him, Joe. Believed him because I wanted so bad for it to be true. And now his boy's fixing to use that same piece of paper to ruin us both, and I signed my own name right at the bottom of it." "You signed it to save our home, Papa. There's no shame in that." "There's shame in not telling you." His voice had gone rough. "For years, Joe. For years I let you build this store up out of nothing, let you believe it was solid ground under your feet, and the whole time there was a hole dug right underneath it that I never once told you was there. That's not a mistake a man makes once, and forgives himself for. That's a mistake he carries." Joe sat down on the step beside him. Didn't say anything for a while. The sky had gone the color of a bruise healing, purple fading into something gentler at the edges. "You didn't put the hole there to hurt me," she said finally. "You put it there so I'd have ground to stand on at all. That's not the same thing as betrayal, Papa, whatever you've been telling yourself alone out here. Feels the same some nights." "I know." She put her hand over his the way she almost never did, because they were not a family given to that kind of touching, and felt him go very still under it, like a man and used to being reached for. "But we're not done yet. I don't know how this ends. I don't have a number that gets us out of it, not tonight. But I know it isn't going to end with you shamed and me quiet about it. That much I promise you." Thomas Caro looked at his daughter in the last of the light, and something in his old, tired face moved, not quite a smile, something closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who has been afraid of a conversation for 4 years and found, at the end of it, that the person he feared disappointing was still sitting beside him. "You were always the stronger one, Joe," he said. "I used to worry on that, used to wish, God forgive me, that you'd been born a little softer, a little easier for this town to hold. I don't wish that anymore. I don't know when I stopped, but I have." Joe didn't answer right away. She sat with that a long moment, the way you sit with something too large to pick up all at once. "Get some rest, Papa," she said finally. "Tomorrow I've got a store to keep perfect." She rode back into Larkspur under a sky gone fully dark, stars coming up hard, and closed the way they only did out here, away from any light, but her own lantern swinging at the saddle. And somewhere on that ride, between her father's porch and the edge of town, She stopped arguing with herself. She didn't examine when it happened. Exactly. Only that by the time the first buildings of Larkspur rose up dark against the stars, she had already decided, in some quiet, unspoken chamber of herself, that she was done pretending a man's help was a thing she could afford to turn away out of pride alone. Pride didn't pay down $700. Pride didn't stop Harlan Voss from putting her father in a cell. She had spent 8 years building a wall out of not needing anybody, brick by brick, out of every slight this town had ever handed her, and the wall had kept her upright. But a wall wasn't the same as a foundation. And right now, tonight, she needed a foundation more than she needed to prove one more time that she could stand alone in the wreckage of one. She rode past the dark windows of her own store, past the church, past the silver rail, still lit and noisy at this hour, laughter spilling out into the street, from men who had no $700 hanging over their heads and no father whose voice had learned, this week, how to crack. She stopped in front of the boarding house instead, sat there a moment on her horse, looking up at the one window still burning at this hour, same as it had burned the night before. She swung down off her horse, tied it to the rail. Her hand found the porch rail, stopped there, because now that she was standing at the bottom of the steps, the whole thing seemed suddenly horribly foolish. A grown woman, riding across town, after dark, to knock on a stranger's door, over a conversation that had lasted all of 10 minutes. What would she even say? I've thought about it. I accept. Accept what exactly? His charity? His company? She didn't know, and not knowing made her want to turn around and ride straight back home and pretend this whole evening had never happened. Except it had happened. Except she was already standing here. Except turning around now would mean carrying $700 and a cracking pencil and a sheriff who wouldn't meet her eyes all the way back to an empty store, alone, the way she'd carried everything else in this town for 8 straight years. So she climbed the steps. Because there was a version of this story, the version Larkspur had already written for her, the version where a woman too proud and too much finally gets what pride earns her, alone on a courthouse step while the whole town looks on and says what a shame. And there was another version. One she hadn't let herself believe in for longer than she could remember. She reached the top step, raised her hand to knock and found it wasn't quite steady, and made herself steady it anyway, the way she'd made herself steady 100 things before. And climbed the rest of the way toward the one lit window, not entirely certain, yet what she meant to say when she got there only certain, for the first time in 8 long years, that she was finished doing this alone. Outside, the street of Larkspur went on about its business, certain the way small towns are always certain, that it already knew exactly how this story was going to end. It did not know a single thing. The door opened, before her hand ever finished the knock. Miss Caro. Nate stood there in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no hat, like a man who hadn't been expecting company and had stopped caring what that meant the second he saw who it was. You rode out here at this hour. I did. Alone. I've been alone a long while, Mr. Ashford. Riding across town in the dark isn't the part that frightens me. He stepped back. Let the door swing wider. Didn't reach for her. Didn't offer his hand. Didn't do a single thing that might have made her feel managed instead of met. Come in, then, before Mrs. Fenwick's whole boarding house wakes up to gossip about it. The room was small. A bed, a washstand, a chair by the window, where his coat hung, over the back, still carrying a little of the trail dust it had ridden in on. Joe stood just inside the door, and did not sit, because sitting felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make yet, though she'd already made the larger one just by climbing these stairs. I've thought about what you said, she told him, standing in my store, about being on the side that makes it right. And I've decided I'm tired of doing this alone. Not because I can't. Her chin came up, the old reflex, the one that had carried her through 8 years of this town's opinions. I want that understood plain before we go any further. I am not asking you to save me, Mr. Ashford. I've never once needed saving. I'm asking whether you meant what you said about standing beside somebody instead. I meant it. Then here's the whole of it. She laid it out for him, flat and orderly, The way she laid out a ledger. The note. The 4 years. The 20 days already down to 16. Sheriff Colby's eyes that wouldn't meet hers, and what that particular kind of silence had told her about exactly how much protection the law in this town was prepared to offer a woman, with no husband, and no money, and a store worth taking. Nate listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a moment, turning something over behind those eyes, that had done a great deal of looking, and not much talking. "Millbrook," he said finally. "What about it? You said Silas Voss paid off a bank note there, 4 years back, to keep your daddy's land clear. Man doesn't pay off a debt that size without the bank keeping some kind of record of it. And if there's a record of the payoff, there ought to be a record of whatever claim came after it too, if that claim was ever filed proper, the way a real lien has to be. And if it wasn't filed, then Harlan Voss doesn't have a legal claim on one board of that store. He's got a private note, maybe, a grudge, certainly, but not a lien the law would ever honor, and not a leg to stand on in front of a judge, who wasn't already in his pocket." Joe felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. Not quite. She'd learned not to trust that particular feeling too quickly. Something steadier. Something closer to a plan. "You'd ride to Millbrook. For me." "For the truth," Nate said. "Which happens, this time, to be standing on your side of the fence. It's 40 miles. I've ridden farther for less." She looked at him a long moment in the lamplight, this stranger who'd been in Larkspur less than a week, and had already offered her more than most men who'd known her a lifetime. And she thought of her mother and the Millbrook man, and every version of help this town had ever handed her, that came stitched through with a price she was expected to pay later, quietly, in some coin nobody named out loud, until it was already spent. "There's always a cost," she said. "Everybody who's ever offered me anything in this town has wanted something back for it eventually. I'd rather know now what you'll want than find out later, when I'm too far in to say no." "I don't want anything back, Joe." "Everybody wants something back." "Fine." Something in his jaw tightened, not with anger, with the particular frustration of a man trying to hand somebody a plain truth, and watching them turn it, over looking for the trick in it. "You want to know what I'll want back? I'll want to know I did one thing right in this life that I can't take back or ruin later. That's the whole of it, Joe. That's the entire price." She studied him, searched his face for the lie the way she searched every column of numbers for the one that didn't add up right, and found, to her own considerable unease, that she couldn't locate it anywhere. "Why?" she said again, because she couldn't help herself, because the question kept climbing back up her throat no matter how many times she thought she'd swallowed it for good. "Why does a stranger ride 40 miles for a woman he's known 5 days? Something moved behind his face. A door, held shut a long while, creaking just slightly on its hinge. "Ask me again when I get back," he said. "I'll tell you the whole of it then. Tonight I'd rather just saddle a horse." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's a promise instead. I find those hold up better over time." He left before first light. Joe watched from her own dark window as he rode east out of Larkspur, dust rising thin and pale behind his gelding in the gray hour before sunrise, and she found herself standing at that glass longer than she meant to, the way she'd found herself standing there every night since he'd first walked into her store. "Don't," she told herself out of old habit. Except this time the word had no teeth in it at all, because she was done pretending this particular hope was something she could smother by stepping back from a pane of glass. She opened the store at the usual hour, swept the same porch, weighed the same flour, and underneath it all, quiet and constant, ran a new current alongside the old one. Not just the awareness of being watched, but the awareness, entirely unfamiliar, of no longer being watched alone. Harlan Voss came to know Nate had ridden out within the hour. That was the thing about a town this size. A stranger's comings and goings were currency, same as anything else, and there was always somebody at the livery willing to trade in it. He didn't come to the store that day. Didn't need to. He simply waited, the way a man waits, who has already decided the outcome, and is only mildly curious about the shape the delay will take. But he did pay a visit to Sheriff Colby's office. Nobody saw what passed between them there, Only that Colby came out afterward looking like a man who'd swallowed something he couldn't quite keep down, and didn't meet the eyes of anyone he passed on his way back to his desk. Nate rode hard that first day, harder than the trail strictly required, because 40 miles felt like nothing, when a man had spent 12 years covering worse ground for causes that mattered a great deal less. The country opened up east of Larkspur, into long, rolling grass gone gold at the edges, with the last of the season. Hawks turned slow circles overhead, riding some current he couldn't feel from the saddle. The road narrowed to little more than a wagon track in places, cutting through country that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to be farmland or wilderness, and he let his horse pick its own pace through the rougher stretches, while his mind wandered the way it wandered on any long ride, loose, unguarded, following whatever thread happened to catch. Caught, this time, on his father's face. He hadn't thought of it in years. Not on purpose, anyway. But something about the shape of what Joe had told him. A note signed in good faith, a neighbor's kindness turned into a weapon by the neighbor's son, had dragged the memory up out of whatever cellar he'd buried it in, whole and sharp as the day it happened. His family had run cattle in a valley 2 states east of here, back when Nate was barely more than a boy. Good land, water that never quit even in a dry year, and a banker 2 towns over who'd smiled the same easy smile Harlan Voss wore, and called Nate's father friend, right up until the season a drought took half the herd, and the bank called the loan due all at once. No warning, no mercy, dressed up afterward as nothing more than sound business practice. They'd lost it all. The land, the water, the herd that was left. His father had died 3 winters later, not of any sickness a doctor could name, just of a man who'd built something with his whole life and watched it taken by somebody who never once had to sweat for a single acre of it. Nate had been 19. Had ridden out not long after because staying meant watching his mother do the same slow dying his father had done, and he hadn't had the stomach for it and had spent every year since telling himself that riding away didn't count as another kind of cowardice. Watching men take things off other men just because they could. He'd told Joe that much standing in her store. Hadn't told her the rest. Hadn't told her how many nights over 12 years he'd lain out under some indifferent sky and thought about riding back to that valley and finding the banker's grave, just to stand over it and feel whatever there was left to feel. He put his heels to the horse, because if he was going to ride 40 miles anyway, he might as well arrive, with something to show for the riding besides an old grief he'd never once managed to put down for good. He made Millbrook a little past noon the second day, dust to his teeth, and did the thing 12 years on the trail had taught him to do in any strange town. He found the one place that knew everything and asked it as little as possible. In Millbrook, that place was the county recorder's office, a narrow brick building wedged between a bank and a dry goods store, and the man who ran it was a clerk named Otis Reddick, thin as a fence post, ink permanently worked into the creases of both hands, with the particular patience of a man who had spent 30 years reading other people's business without ever once being tempted to gossip about it. Nate didn't tell him a story. He'd learned long ago that a story gets remembered and repeated. A plain, small question gets forgotten by supper. Looking to trace a payoff, he said. Bank note. For years back, a man named Silas Voss cleared a mortgage debt for a fellow named Thomas Caro over in Larkspur. I'd like to see whatever got recorded on it. Reddick squinted at him over a pair of spectacles that had slid halfway down his nose and never once looked inclined to go any further. You a lawyer? No, sir. Just a man doing a favor. Recordings public. Costs you a nickel a copy. Reddick heaved a ledger off a shelf that groaned under the weight of a dozen others just like it, and thumbed through it with a wet finger, muttering names under his breath. Voss, 4 years back, you said. That's right. Here. He turned the book around, tapped a line with one ink-stained finger. There's your payoff. Silas Voss paid the Millbrook Farmers Bank $380 on behalf of Thomas Caro. Cleared the mortgage lien. Recorded plain right there. Nate read it twice. 380. That's what it says. Is there a private note recorded alongside it? Something where Caro agreed to pay Voss back with the land or the store standing as security if he couldn't? Reddick frowned. ran his finger down the page, turned it back. No lien filed. Payoffs here, plain as day, but there's nothing recorded. That puts a claim on Caro title. Whatever private arrangement those two men might have made between themselves, and men do that plenty, it never got filed against the land, which means it never attached to it. You can't take a man's land on a note that was never recorded against it, mister. That's just not how a lien works, not in this county, nor any other I've ever heard tell of. Nate went very still. Say that again, he said. Slow. Reddick said it again, slow, and Nate Ashford stood in the county recorder's office in Millbrook and felt the whole shape of it turn, over in his hands, like a stone flipped in a creek bed, showing him everything that had been hiding underneath. $380. Not $700. Whatever Harlan Voss was calling in, whatever ironclad note he was waving around Larkspur like a man holding a winning hand, it had never once been recorded as a lien against Caro land. Which meant it didn't attach. Which meant whatever private arrangement had passed between Thomas Caro and Silas Voss all those years ago, Harlan had no legal power whatsoever to take that store. He'd needed Jo, and her father too frightened, too proud, and too broke to ever check. I need copies, Nate said. Of all of it. The payoff, the lien release, the clear title. Everything with Caro name on it. Certified if you do that for me, so a man can't stand there and claim I made it up out of whole cloth. Reddick was already reaching for his pen. Nickel a page. Give me 2 of each. He glanced up, something almost like a smile working at the corner of his mouth. You want me to guess why a fella rides 40 miles alone to fetch paperwork he could have asked the Caros to fetch themselves? Wouldn't have got here as fast, Nate said. And there's a clock running that I don't much trust anybody else to watch, as close as I intend to. Reddick worked in silence a while, dipping his pen, copying figures in a careful, practiced hand that never once hurried and never once slowed. Nate stood at the counter and watched Larkspur's whole fate get written out fresh in another man's ink, 40 miles from the town it belonged to, and found the waiting harder than any hour of riding had been. You mind me asking, Reddick said, not looking up, what's a woman done to earn a man riding this hard on her account? Nothing but her own work, mostly. Kept a store standing 11 years, while half a town told her she oughtn't be able to. Reddick's pen paused, just briefly, over the page. Sounds like a woman worth the riding, then. Getting to look that way, Nate said, and left it there, because it was more than he'd meant to say out loud to a stranger, with ink on his fingers, and he suspected Reddick understood that well enough not to press it further. The clerk finished his copies, pressed the county seal into each one, careful, unhurried, and folded them into a neat stack that Nate tucked away into the oilcloth like it was worth more than gold, because on that particular afternoon, in that particular county, it very nearly was. He didn't sleep in Millbrook. Got his certified copies, folded them careful into an oilcloth against his chest, bought a fresh horse to spell his tired gelding, and rode out at dusk on the road back west. Because 20 days had a way of becoming 19, then 18, while a man slept easy in a strange bed, and he'd told Jo Caro he'd come home with paper, and he intended to keep that particular promise the same way he'd have kept any other. The dark came down complete before he'd covered 10 miles, stars close and hard overhead the way they only got out on open ground, and somewhere in that riding, going over it and over it the way a man does with a thing he can't quite believe his own luck on, one piece of it kept snagging. $380. Harlan was asking for $700. Even a greedy man doesn't usually double a number out of thin air. He inflates it careful. Adds a little interest, makes it sound plausible to somebody too frightened to check the arithmetic close. 700 was too round, too bold, and a note, that bold, waved by a man, that eager, kept hidden from the one person who actually had the right to read it. Nate reined up in the dark, letting the thought finish itself all the way through. Harlan Voss wasn't inflating a real debt. He was betting his whole scheme on the certainty that nobody would ever read the actual note close enough to catch him at it. He put his heels to the horse again, because there was more to this than a man's cruelty, more than a grudge 4 years old, and a town's easy willingness to believe the worst of a woman, who wouldn't shrink for anybody. A man that reckless, that eager to cut every corner in sight, wasn't just settling an old score. He was after something bigger, and Nate meant to find out what, before Harlan Voss finished doing whatever it was he'd already started. He rode through the night without stopping, trading his tired gelding for the fresh horse at a way station somewhere past the halfway mark, and pressed on through a second dawn with his eyes burning, and his back aching in ways 12 years on the trail should have long since toughened him against. He did not stop to rest. Did not stop to eat more than a strip of dried beef chewed slow in the saddle. Because every mile behind him was a mile closer to a woman he'd left standing in a doorway, with a father in custody, and a debt she believed, for all she knew, was still entirely real, and some stubborn, unexamined part of him could not shake the fear that he'd return to find the whole thing already decided, without him, one way or the other, the way things in this world had a habit of deciding themselves, while a man was busy being somewhere else. By the second evening his own shadow had started playing tricks on him in the failing light, throwing shapes across the trail that weren't there, and he understood, distantly, that he was pushing both horses and himself past what was sensible. He did it anyway, because sensible had never once, in his experience, been the thing that saved anybody. Back in Larkspur several days had passed, with Nate still gone, and Jo had spent them telling herself that was to be expected, that Millbrook and back was 3 days hard riding at the very least, and that worry accomplished exactly nothing a ledger couldn't accomplish better. She was elbow-deep in flour sacks, restocking a shelf that didn't strictly need restocking, when the bell over the door rang and Sheriff Colby walked in. He wasn't alone. Harlan Voss stood a half-step behind him, hat in hand, wearing an expression that tried for solemn and landed somewhere closer to satisfied. "Miss Caro." Colby's eyes found the floor almost immediately, the same way they had in his office. "I need a word with your father. Is he about?" "He's at the house." "What's this concerning, Sheriff?" "There's been a complaint filed." Colby's jaw worked, like the words tasted wrong going out. "Question of forged papers on the Caro land deed. I'm obliged to look into it." "You mean Harlan told you a lie, and you're obliged to pretend it isn't one?" "Miss Caro." "Say it plain, Sheriff. In front of him, if you're too much of a coward to say it, without him standing there holding your spine up for you." Colby's face went dark red. Harlan, behind him, said nothing at all, didn't need to. His silence doing exactly the work he wanted it to do, patient and pleased. "I need to speak with your father," Colby said again, quieter this time, almost apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "Today. This afternoon." They found Thomas on the porch of the house he'd built, with his own hands 30 years before, and Jo watched her father's face go, through every stage of understanding in the space of a single breath, confusion, then dread, then a terrible, resigned kind of calm, the calm of a man who has been waiting for a particular knock for 4 long years and has finally heard it. "Thomas Caro." Colby's voice had none of the ease it usually carried at the counter, buying nails, trading talk about the weather. "There's a question been raised about the deed to your land. I've got to ask you to come into town with me, answer some questions proper in front of a magistrate." "You're arresting him," Jo said, flat, cold, "over a claim Harlan Voss made up out of whole cloth, because I wouldn't sign my store," into his hands quiet. "I'm not arresting anybody, Miss Caro. I'm asking him to come answer questions. There's a difference." "Not much of one from where I'm standing." Thomas set his hand on her arm, gentle, the way he used to, when she was small enough to need steadying, over something far less enormous than this. "It's all right, Jo." "It is not all right, Papa. I'll go." His voice was quiet, steady in a way that cost him visibly to hold on to. "I've got nothing to hide from any magistrate in this county. Let them look at whatever they think they've found. I signed that deed honest, same as I signed everything else in my life." He went with Colby without another word of argument, though Jo saw his hand shake on the porch rail as he steadied himself down the steps, and she stood there in the yard long, after the 2 horses had carried her father away down the road toward town, feeling something in her chest go colder and harder and more determined than it had felt in all 4 years of carrying this particular weight. Harlan lingered a moment longer than the others, tipped his hat, slow, savoring it. Shame how these things happen, he said. Man gets old, gets careless with his paperwork. Costs him more than he ever meant it to. You'll answer for this, Harlan. Will I? He smiled, easy as breathing, and turned his horse toward town. 16 days, Joe. 15, come morning. I'd start thinking real hard on that easy road I mentioned. Getting harder to see, from where you're standing, I expect, with your daddy sitting in a magistrate's office answering for crimes he didn't commit. He rode off, and Joe Caro stood alone in her father's yard, in the long gold light of a late afternoon, that didn't care one bit what had just happened underneath it, and let herself, for exactly 1 minute, feel the whole enormous weight of it. Word of Thomas Caro questioning reached the rest of Larkspur, before Colby's horse had even finished tying off outside his office. Mabel Pruitt got hold of it first, of course, and by suppertime had already reshaped it into something considerably more damning than the truth, telling anyone who'd stand still long enough that old Thomas had likely been forging deeds for years, and wasn't it a wonder the girl hadn't known, running his books the way she did, unless, Mabel added, with the particular relish she saved for her cruelest insinuations, she'd known all along and helped him do it. Not everyone carried it that way. Mrs. Odell heard the same news at the dry goods counter, and set her jaw in a hard, flat line. That's a lie built out of a rich man's convenience, she told Mabel plainly, in front of 3 other customers. And I'd thank you not to spread it in my hearing twice. Old Purdy heard it at the livery and said nothing at all, which was, for Purdy, its own kind of statement. He simply walked the half-mile out to the Caro place that evening unasked and sat on the porch step while in silence the way he had that very first morning outside the store, only this time it wasn't shame keeping him quiet. It was company, offered the only way a man like Purdy knew how to offer it. Even Reverend Whitfield, hearing the story secondhand, before he ever learned the truth of the receipt tucked in, that Bible, found himself troubled enough to walk to the sheriff's office and ask, gently but plainly, whether Thomas Caro had been afforded a lawyer, and whether the magistrate's circuit could be hurried along any faster than the usual slow crawl of county business. Cost him nothing, that small kindness. It meant, to Joe, when she heard of it later, a great deal more than the Reverend likely ever guessed. Then she rode into town because she needed to see her father with her own eyes before she could think clearly enough to do anything else. Colby kept him in a back room off the sheriff's office, not a proper cell, just a narrow space with a cot and a barred window, and he let Joe in without much argument, though he wouldn't meet her eyes doing it. Thomas sat on the edge of the cot, hands folded between his knees, looking smaller than she had ever once seen him look, even in the worst of his illness. Papa! Joe! He tried to smile. It didn't hold. Don't fuss. I'm not hurt. Just sitting. I know you didn't forge anything. I know it too. Doesn't seem to matter much, does it, what a man knows about himself, when there's a magistrate coming, through in a few days, and a rich man's word sitting heavier on the scale than mine. Joe sat down on the cot beside him, took his hand, the way she almost never did, and felt him grip back harder than she expected, like a man holding onto the one solid thing left in a room that had otherwise gone entirely unsteady beneath him. I keep thinking on your mother, Thomas said quietly. How she used to say you'd make it hard on yourself, being what you are. I used to worry on that same thing, Joe. Worried on it for years. And now here I am, an old man sitting in a back room because I signed a piece of paper I trusted too easy, and it's you standing here steady as a fence post holding both our lives together with nothing but arithmetic and nerve. He shook his head slow. Maybe your mother had the whole thing backward. Maybe what she should have worried on was whether the rest of us would ever manage to be half as strong as you. When the day finally came, that strength was the only thing left that mattered. Don't talk like the day's already lost, Papa. It isn't. No, he said, and something in his voice steadied, just slightly borrowing whatever strength she'd managed to lend him just by sitting close. No, I don't suppose it is. Not with you out there fighting it. She stayed until Colby, apologetic and awkward, told her visiting hours at the makeshift cell were done for the evening. She rode home in the dark, with her father's hand still warm in the memory of her own. And it was that memory, more than anything else, that sent her searching the house, that night instead of simply falling into bed exhausted and afraid. The house was too quiet, without him in it. She lit a lamp in the front room and sat along while doing nothing at all, which was itself a strange enough thing, that she noticed it happening the way she noticed any behavior in herself that didn't fit the pattern of 11 years behind a counter. Because usually, when the world came apart, she reached for a ledger. Numbers. Something with edges she could hold on to. Tonight, the numbers felt useless. 20 days. 16. Whatever the count actually stood at now. None of it mattered. Not really. Not if a magistrate believed Harlan Voss's lie, before Nate ever made it back, with anything to disprove it. Arithmetic couldn't argue with a courtroom. Arithmetic couldn't sit in a cell in her father's place, couldn't stand up and swear to a judge that an old man's hands had never once, not in 60 years, forged a single thing. Think, Joe. Think it through proper the way you think through everything else. Except there was nothing to think through. Except she'd already turned the problem over a dozen times and found the same blank wall waiting on every side of it. Except the one person who might have known what to do next was 2 days gone on a road she couldn't ride herself, not with the store needing tending, and her father needing whatever visiting the sheriff would still allow. She got up, paced the length of the front room once, twice, a third time because sitting still had become, in the last hour, entirely unbearable. Stop it. Stop pacing like a caged thing. You've never once solved a problem by wearing a groove in your own floorboards. She stopped, made herself sit again, lasted perhaps 4 minutes before she was back on her feet. And yet, she opened the store the next morning anyway. Same hour as always. Swept the same porch, though her hands shook doing it, though half of Larkspur's eyes seemed fixed on her. That whole long day, waiting to see whether the proud Caro girl would finally crack under a weight even she couldn't out-argue. She did not crack. She weighed flour, counted coins, told a customer, flat and businesslike, that yes, her father was being questioned, and no, she did not believe for one moment he'd done anything wrong, and if anyone in this town cared to say different to her face rather than behind it, she'd be glad to hear the accusation plain, right here across this very counter. Nobody took her up on the offer, because that, too, was Joe Caro, the thing this whole town had never once managed to break in 8 years of trying. Whatever came through, that door, grief, fear, a father in custody, a debt the size of a mountain, she opened the store anyway, and kept it perfect, and dared the world to find one single crack in the keeping, which was when she remembered the Bible, not because she expected anything from it. Only because her father had mentioned it once, years back, in the offhand way people mention things that don't seem important until, suddenly, everything about them becomes important all at once. A place he kept important papers, tucked between the pages nobody in her family had ever managed to read straight through. She told herself she was only looking for the deed. Something, anything, with weight enough to carry into that magistrate's office and lay down like a shield. She had no idea, climbing the stairs toward her parents' room, that she was about to find something far larger than a shield. The Bible sat on the shelf, where it had always sat, heavy and worn soft at the corners, her mother's careful hand recording births and deaths on the front pages in ink gone brown with age. Joe lifted it down. She sat on the edge of the bed that had been her parents' bed and her grandparents' before that and opened it, with hands that were not, for once, entirely steady. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that her father had once said, half a lifetime ago it seemed now, that he kept important things pressed inside these pages, the deed to the first parcel of land, her own certificate of baptism, a lock of her mother's hair tied with faded ribbon. She turned pages. Genesis, Exodus, the long dry stretches of Leviticus that nobody in her family had ever managed to read straight through. And there, between the last page of Malachi and the first of Matthew, pressed flat and gone soft with age, she found a single folded sheet of paper. Her hands were shaking now. She made herself unfold it slow, careful, the way you'd handle something that might crumble if you rushed it. Received of Thomas Caro the sum of $700, being full and complete payment of all debts between us. Paid in full. No further claim. Silas Voss. And beneath it, in a different hand, witness, Reverend Amos Whitfield. The date sat at the top, plain as anything. 2 years back. Joe read it twice. Then a third time because the first 2 readings hadn't managed to make it feel real yet. Hadn't managed to close the enormous gap between what she'd believed that morning and what she now held in her own 2 hands. "Papa," she said out loud, to an empty room, to nobody at all. "Papa, you paid it. You paid it 2 years ago and you forgot." Except that wasn't quite right either, and even in the wreckage of the moment some steady ledger keeping part of her mind insisted on getting the facts exactly straight. He hadn't forgotten the paying. He'd forgotten, or buried so deep he might as well have forgotten, the fact that the fear itself had outlived the debt, that he'd spent 2 years carrying a weight that had already technically, legally been set down. Because that was the particular cruelty of shame, she thought, sitting there on her parents' bed, with a 2-year-old receipt trembling in her hands. It didn't need the actual debt to survive. It could go right on living long after the thing that created it was paid and settled and witnessed by a man of God, simply because nobody had ever thought to go back and check. She folded the receipt carefully, held it against her chest, over her heart, the way she imagined a person might hold something they'd been praying for, without quite admitting to themselves that they were praying at all. Then she went to find the Reverend. Reverend Amos Whitfield's study smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, and he went very pale when Joe laid the receipt down in front of him on his own desk. "I'd forgotten," he said, and his voice had gone thin, almost frightened. "God forgive me. I'd forgotten entirely. I sat right there at Silas Voss's own kitchen table when he wrote this out. He wanted a clergyman for a witness," he said, because the Reverend stopped. His hand came up, pressed against his mouth, like he could hold the rest of the sentence back by force. "Because he said his son had grabby hands, and he wanted the debt cleared clean and witnessed proper, so that boy of his could never come back one day and pretend it wasn't paid." The room went very quiet. "Silas knew," Joe said slowly. "He knew what Harlan might do, even then, and he tried to stop it, from beyond his own grave, with a piece of paper and a preacher's signature. And I let it sit forgotten in a drawer for 2 years. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old ash. While that very thing he feared went right ahead, and happened anyway, not 30 feet from my own church, and I never once thought to connect the two. You'll testify to it, if it comes to that. Miss Carroll." The Reverend straightened in his chair, and something in his soft, ministerial face set into something harder, something Joe hadn't seen in him before, not in all the years she'd sat in his pews. "Silas Voss asked me to witness that debt paid because he trusted me to see it stayed paid. I have failed at that trust for 2 years running. I will not fail at it one day longer. I'll stand up and say every single word of what I just told you, in front of anyone who'll listen, magistrate or otherwise. It is 4 years overdue, and I am ashamed it took a receipt in a family Bible to remind me of my own obligation." "There's more, Reverend." Joe hesitated, then pressed forward, because there was no gentler way to ask it. "My father's being held on suspicion of forgery. If the magistrate saw this receipt and heard your word alongside it, do you believe it might be enough to see him released before the circuit judge even arrives?" Whitfield was quiet a moment, turning the receipt over careful in his ink-stained fingers, the same way Reddick had turned his own ledgers, the same way Nate had turned his hat. A whole county of careful men, she thought, finally turning careful attention toward the one family that had gone without it far too long. "I believe it might," he said finally. "I intend to make certain of it. First light tomorrow, Miss Carroll, I will walk into that sheriff's office myself, and I will not walk back out until your father walks out beside me." He kept that promise. Colby read the receipt 3 times, over at his desk the next morning, Reverend Whitfield standing beside him the whole, while with his arms folded and an expression that made plain he intended to stand there until the sun went down again, if that was what it took. "This doesn't clear the forgery question," Colby said finally, though his voice had lost most of the certainty it carried the day before. "That's a separate matter. Question of the deed itself, not the note." "No," Whitfield agreed, "but it does considerably weaken any claim that Thomas Carroll had reason to forge anything at all. Wouldn't you say, Sheriff?" A man doesn't generally falsify papers to escape a debt he'd already paid 2 years prior. Rather works against the whole notion of motive, I'd think, and I understand motive counts for something even in matters of law. Colby looked at the receipt again. Looked at the Reverend, whose patience showed no sign whatsoever of thinning. Looked, finally, toward the back room where Thomas Caro sat waiting, and something in his broad, tired face seemed to settle, at last, on a decision he'd perhaps been wanting to make, since the moment Harlan Voss first walked into his office. "I can release him pending the circuit judge's review," he said. "Won't clear him outright, that's not mine to decide. But I've got no cause to hold a man on a debt that's sitting here, paid in full, witnessed by a preacher of this county. I should have asked to see the note itself, before I ever agreed to bring him in. That's on me, and I'll own it." He unlocked the back room himself. Thomas came out blinking, into the morning light like a man stepping out of a much longer darkness than 3 days could account for, and when he saw Joe waiting in the front office, something in his face broke open entirely, all the careful, quiet dignity he'd been holding onto for days finally giving way to something rawer. "Joe, I found it, Papa. In Mama's Bible. The receipt. You paid it. 2 years ago you paid every dollar of it, and Reverend Whitfield stood right there and watched you do it." Thomas stood very still a moment, absorbing that, and then he did something Joe had not seen her father do since her mother's funeral. He wept openly, unashamed, right there in the front office of the sheriff's building, and Joe crossed the room and put her arms around him and let him, because some griefs, and this she understood now, watching 4 years of quiet shame finally lift off her father's shoulders all at once, was as much a grief as it was a relief, needed exactly that kind of releasing in exactly that kind of company. Word of the release moved through Larkspur nearly as fast as word of the arrest had, and this time Joe noticed it moved a little differently. Mabel Pruitt, to her credit, said nothing at all when she heard it, the closest thing to an apology Joe suspected the woman was constitutionally capable of offering. Mrs. Odell simply nodded once, satisfied, as though the outcome had never once been in doubt in her own mind. And old Purdy, hearing it at the livery, allowed himself something that might, on a more generous face, have counted as a smile. It wasn't vindication. Not yet. The circuit judge still had to close the matter formal, and Harlan Voss still walked free, and the store still stood scorched, and threatened with a debt already proven false, but not yet proven finished with them. But it was something. A small crack of daylight after days of none, and Joe found she was grateful for it in a way that surprised her, grateful not for herself, particularly, but for her father, who had spent 4 years believing himself the architect of his own family's ruin, and had learned in one single morning that the ruin had never been real at all. Nate rode into Larkspur a little past dusk on the 3rd day, both horses lathered and blown, dust caked so thick on his coat it had turned the same gray-brown as the road itself. He didn't go to the boarding house, rode straight for the feed store and found it dark, closed up for the night, and for one terrible second his heart dropped clean through the floor of him, certain, absolutely certain, that he'd arrived too late, that Harlan had already taken it, while he was 3 days gone on a fool's errand for certified paper. Then a lamp moved in the little rooms behind the store, and the back door opened, and Joe Caro stood there, with her father's old shotgun leveled steady at his chest. "It's me," Nate said, both hands going up, still a horse. "It's Ashford. Don't shoot me after 90 miles, Miss Caro. I take it hard." The shotgun came down, and then she was off the porch step, and across the yard, one hand catching his stirrup like it was the only solid thing left standing in the whole world, looking up at him with a face that had clearly been crying, and would deny it, he suspected, to her very grave. "You came back," she said. "Said I would. Papa was taken in for questioning while you were gone. Held 3 days before the Reverend, and I got him released, found something in Mama's Bible that changed the sheriff's mind. He's home now, resting, but Harlan still got the whole town believing there was real cause for it, and the circuit judge hasn't closed the matter yet. I know. Heard it at the livery, before I'd even finished tying off my horse." Nate swung down, stiff from 3 days in the saddle, and reached into his coat, careful, and drew out the oilcloth packet, dust-stained but whole. "Here's a true thing, Joe. Read it. Then I want to hear whatever's put That look on your face. Because I don't believe for 1 second it's only bad news sitting behind your eyes right now. She unwrapped the packet with hands that had gone steady again, steadier than his own, after the ride, and read by lamplight on the back step, while he watched her lips move on the numbers. 380, she said when she reached it. Her voice had gone strange. Nate, it says 380. He's asking 700. He is. And there's no lien, no claim ever filed on the land. None. Whatever paper Harlan's been waving around, it was never recorded proper, which means it never attached to a single board of that store, Joe. He's had 4 years of a bluff and nothing behind it, but a town too frightened and too polite to ever ask him to prove it. Joe made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something caught halfway between the two, and reached into her own coat. There's more, she said. This is what got Papa released while you were on the road. I found it in my mother's Bible the night they took him in. My father paid the private note, all 700 of it. 2 years ago. There's a receipt, Nate, signed by Silas Voss himself, witnessed by Reverend Whitfield. Now it was Nate's turn to go very still. Paid, he said, 2 years back. Paid in full. No further claim. She held the receipt out to him, and he took it careful, the way he'd taken the certified copies, from Reddick's careful hands, like both documents were made of something far more fragile than paper. He read it again, and when he looked up at her, there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before, not once in 5 days of knowing him, something that looked almost like wonder, the particular wonder of a man watching a debt he'd carried a long, long way finally, unexpectedly, come untied. There's no debt, he said slowly. Joe, there was never a lien, and even if there had been, it's already paid. Twice over, in a sense. He's got nothing. He never had anything. Then why? Joe said, and the question had been sitting in her, since the moment she read the receipt, cold and insistent, refusing to let itself be set aside even by the enormous relief crowding in around it. Why would a man risk this much, lie to a sheriff, put my father in a magistrate's custody, threaten to ruin us in front of the whole town, over a debt he had to know, better than anyone, was already settled? A man doesn't do that just to be cruel, Nate. Even Harlan. There's cruel, and then there's reckless enough to get himself hanged for it. And Harlan Voss is a great many terrible things. But he has never once, in all the years I've known him, been a stupid man. Nate was quiet a long moment, turning the receipt over in his hands, and when he spoke again his voice had gone careful, the voice of a man testing ground he wasn't, yet sure would hold his weight. He's not trying to win in front of a judge, he said slowly. He never was. He's counting on taking the store, before this ever reaches a courtroom, where somebody might actually read the paper close. Which means there's something here worth more to him than the money he's pretending to collect. Something that needs this exact piece of ground, and needs it fast, before anybody starts asking why a feed store's suddenly worth putting an old man in a magistrate's chair over. They sat with that a while, side by side on the back step, the receipt and the certified copies both laid careful across Joe's knee, and the night settling in slow around them the way it did on the rare evenings this far out, that felt, for a moment, almost peaceful. You said you'd tell me, Joe said finally, when you got back, the whole of why. Nate didn't answer right away. Turned the empty coffee tin he'd carried out, with him the same careful way he turned everything, like the answer might be hiding somewhere in the shape of it. My family ran cattle, he said at last. 2 states east of here. Good land. Water that never quit, even dry years. He kept his eyes on the dark yard, not on her the way a man talks when the talking is easier if he doesn't have to watch the listening happen. There was a banker. Smiled a great deal, called my father friend, right up until a drought took half our herd, and he called the whole loan due at once. No warning. Dressed it up, after as nothing more than sound business. Nate, we lost it. All of it. Land, water, what herd was left. My father died 3 winters later. Wasn't any sickness a doctor had a name for. Just a man who'd built something with his whole life and watched somebody else take it, who never once had to sweat for a single acre of it. He set the tin down, looked at her now, finally, and there was nothing hidden left in his face, not anymore. I was 19, rode out not long after because staying meant watching my mother do the same slow dying, and I didn't have the stomach for it. Told myself for 12 years that riding away wasn't its own kind of cowardice. Mostly managed to believe it. And then you rode into a town, Joe said quietly, and found a woman about to lose everything the exact same way. Found a woman about to lose everything the exact same way, and this time I had 2 good legs, and a horse rested enough to do something about it. He looked at her steady, and whatever door had been standing ajar this whole, while finally swung the rest of the way open. That's the whole truth, Joe. Not some fine speech about chivalry. I've been carrying 12 years of watching that happened to other people and never once getting to be on the side that stopped it. You gave me the chance. I wasn't about to ride past it twice in one lifetime. Joe sat with that a long moment. The lamp behind them threw a small warm square of light out across the yard, and somewhere off in the dark a horse shifted its weight, and she found, sitting there beside a man who just handed her the one thing he'd clearly kept locked away longest, that she didn't have a single sharp thing left in her to say back to him. "I'm sorry," she said instead simply. "About your father. I know." He almost smiled, the tired, worn kind of almost smile that comes after a confession finally set down. "First time in 12 years I've said the whole of it out loud to another living soul. Feels strange. Lighter than I expected." "Good," Joe said. "Things ought to feel lighter once you've finally said them." They sat a while longer in the quiet, not needing to fill it with anything more, and if her hand found its way at some point in that long companionable silence to rest beside his on the step, not quite touching, but close enough, that the closeness itself said something neither of them was ready. Yet to say out loud, neither one of them moved to change it. They found the surveyor's stakes 2 mornings later, out past the eastern edge of the Caro property, planted in a neat, deliberate line that ran straight through what had always been open range. Neither of them had gone looking for stakes, exactly. They'd ridden out that morning simply to walk the boundary of the land Thomas had worked his whole life, the way a person walks a piece of ground they're afraid of losing, memorizing it, as if memory itself might count for something in whatever fight was still ahead of them. The grass stood high and gold, unmowed since the last of the haying, and the morning air still carried a faint char on it, from the fire 2 nights before, a smell that hadn't fully cleared and, Joe suspected, wouldn't fully clear from that yard for a long while yet. It was Nate who spotted the first stake, a slim wooden post no taller than a man's knee, driven into the ground at a precise, deliberate angle that had nothing accidental about it. "Somebody's been surveying," he said, crouching beside it. Joe crouched beside one, running her thumb over a brass marker stamped, with letters she didn't recognize at first, a railroad company's mark, small and official, and entirely out of place on a stretch of grass that had never seen anything grander than cattle and wildflowers. "Railroad," she said. "Spur line, most like." Nate crouched beside her, studying the line of stakes as it ran off toward the horizon. "I've seen this kind of marking before out west. Company runs a survey ahead of the main line, scouting for water, for grade, for any place that makes sense to break off a spur, and run freight in closer to a town that'll pay to have it. And a spur line needs a depot, a place to load and unload. Needs water too, usually, and flat, solid ground close to the center of whatever town it's serving." Nate stood, dusting his hands on his trousers, looking back toward Larkspur's rooftops rising up gold in the morning light. "Joe, where does your store sit, exactly, relative to the old town well?" She felt the answer arrive, before she'd even finished doing the sum in her head, the way the worst answers always seem to. "Dead center," she said. "The well's not 40 yards from my own back door. Been that way since before the town had a proper street laid out around it." Nate looked at the stakes, looked back at her. "I don't believe Harlan Voss wants your store because of any debt at all," he said slowly. "I believe he wants it because whoever owns that lot when the railroad comes through stands to make more money in a single sale than this whole town's made in the last 10 years combined." And I believe he's been counting on getting it signed over quiet, under cover of a debt nobody thought to question, before a single other soul in Larkspur ever puts these two facts side by side the way we just did. They walked their horses back toward town slow, in no particular hurry, the morning still cool enough, that neither of them minded the extra time it cost. "You're quiet," Nate said after a while. "Thinking. About the railroad? About how long I've been telling myself I could carry any weight this town set on my shoulders, so long as I did it alone." Jo kept her eyes on the trail ahead, on the grass bending soft under the horses' feet. "I've spent 8 years proving that to myself over and over, every single time somebody called me too much for wanting to. And now here I am, letting a man I've known 2 weeks ride 40 miles, and burn his own wrist pulling water buckets, and I keep waiting to feel ashamed of that. Keep waiting for the old voice to tell me I've gone soft. Has it come yet? The voice? No." She said it slow, like she was testing the truth of it, as the word left her mouth. "No, it hasn't. I don't know what that means." "Maybe it means the voice was never yours to begin with," Nate said. "Maybe it was just this whole town, talking so long, and so loud you forgot it wasn't your own thinking anymore." Jo looked over at him, at the dust still riding his coat, at the careful, unhurried way he sat a horse like a man who'd made peace, with taking his time, over things that mattered. And she felt something settle in her chest, that had nothing to do with debts or deeds, or railroads at all, something steadier, something that had been building quietly, since the night she first knocked on his door, and hadn't stopped building since. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't believe I'd have found any of this without you. The stakes, the paper in Millbrook, none of it. You'd have found it," Nate said. "Might have taken longer, but I've watched you work a ledger, Jo Caro. There isn't a column in this county you couldn't eventually run down to the truth of it, given enough time." "You didn't answer what I said." "No," he agreed, and something in his voice had gone quieter, more careful. "I suppose I didn't. Truth is, I'm not sure I trust myself yet to answer it the way I'd want to. Not with your father still sitting under a magistrate's shadow, and a fire still smoking behind your own store. Feels like the wrong hour for it." "And the right hour? When this is finished," he said. "When there's nothing left standing between us, but whatever we actually want to build. I'd rather say it then, Jo, when you know for certain it isn't gratitude talking. When you know it's just me." She didn't answer that either, not in words. But she let her horse drift a little closer to his on the last stretch back into town, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and neither one of them moved to put the distance back. It was Roy Voss who confirmed the rest of it, though he never meant to. Jo found him at the livery 2 days later, alone, mucking out a stall, with the particular joylessness of a man doing a job he'd been handed, as punishment for something, and something in his face. When he saw her, some flicker of guilt he couldn't quite smother fast enough, made her stop instead of walking past. "Roy," he didn't look up. "Jo, I know about the railroad survey." His hands went still on the pitchfork, just for a second, but she saw it, the way she'd learned to see every small, betraying thing a man's body did, when his mouth was still working out how to lie. "Don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I think you've known for a while now exactly what your cousin's really after, and I think it's sitting on you harder than you're letting on, mucking out a stall like a man trying to outrun his own conscience." Roy set the pitchfork against the stall wall. Wouldn't meet her eyes. "You were never like him," Jo said, quieter now. "Not really. I've watched you laugh at his jokes half a second late for years. Roy, like a man who never quite believed what he was laughing at. I always wondered why you stayed close to him anyway." "He's family." Roy's voice cracked on the word, thin and unconvincing even to his own ears, she could tell. "Man doesn't just walk away from family. Even when family's about to see an innocent man ruined. Even when it's your own hand that has to help do it." He didn't answer that, just stood there a long moment, jaw working, and when he finally spoke again his voice had dropped low, almost pleading. "He's not just after the store, Jo," he said. "He's been buying up half the loose land around it for months. Quiet like, Through a fellow out of Millbrook nobody in town would think to connect back to him. Your store's the last piece. The only piece he couldn't just buy outright, on account of your daddy never being willing to sell. He glanced up, finally, and there was something almost pleading in it. I didn't want any part of the sheriff business. That was Harlan's notion, not mine. I told him it had gone too far. He didn't much care to hear it. Is there a document, Roy? Something with my father's name on it. Something Harlan's already prepared, ready to file, soon as he thinks nobody's looking close enough to stop him. Roy's silence answered, before his mouth ever managed to. I don't know for certain, he said finally, low, but I've heard him talk about a bill of sale. Heard him say your daddy's signature wouldn't be hard to manage, given how shaky the old man's hand's gone these past years, and given how few folks in this county would think to compare it letter for letter against anything real. Joe felt the ground shift under the whole shape of the last 4 years. Every threat, every insult, every long patient month of Harlan Voss playing at collecting a debt he'd known all along was fiction. It had never once been about the note. It had always been about this. A forged signature, a railroad's money, and a woman the whole town had already decided wouldn't be believed, when she finally stood up and said so. Why tell me now, she asked. After all this time saying nothing. Roy looked at the pitchfork he'd set down, like the answer might be written somewhere on the worn wooden handle. Because I watched your daddy get walked into that sheriff's office, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my doing. I was only holding the door. But holding a door open's still a kind of doing, Joe, when you know full well what's about to walk through it. He met her eyes at last, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that she'd never once seen there before. I'm not asking forgiveness. I don't reckon I've earned any. I'm just done holding doors for him. Harlan Voss learned, that same evening, that his cousin had been talking. He sat alone in the back room of his own ranch house along, while after Roy's confession reached him, a bottle of good whiskey going warm and untouched at his elbow, and did the kind of arithmetic he rarely bothered with, the arithmetic of a man watching a carefully built thing come apart faster than he could patch it. The railroad money had never been a maybe. He'd known it for the better part of a year now, ever since a surveyman passing, through Millbrook let slip, over cards and too much drink, exactly which stretch of country the new spur line was likeliest to favor. He'd spent months, since buying up every loose parcel around, that stretch, quiet, patient, through a Millbrook agent nobody in Larkspur would ever think to trace back to his own name. Every parcel but one. The one sitting dead center of the whole survey, with a well on it older than the town itself, and a woman too stubborn, and a father too proud to ever sell it outright, no matter what price he offered. He'd told himself at the start that the note was simply the easiest lever. Debt, shame, an old man's fear, cheaper and quieter than an honest offer, that would only draw questions he couldn't afford answered. He hadn't counted on a drifter riding through with a taste for lost causes. Hadn't counted on his own cousin's conscience finding its spine at the exact worst possible hour. He thought of the bill of sale sitting in his desk drawer, Thomas Caro forged signature already dry, upon it, ready to file the moment he judged the timing right. Thought of how thin that timing had just become. A careful man would have stopped there, would have cut his losses, burned the forged paper himself, and found some other parcel, some other scheme, some other year to try again. Harlan Voss had never once in his life been the kind of man who knew how to stop. He finished the whiskey after all. And before the night was through, he'd sent for Pute. Nobody ever confirmed exactly how word of Roy's confession moved through town so fast. Roy swore afterward he hadn't breathed a word to anyone. But Joe swore she hadn't told a living soul beyond Nate and the Reverend. But word moved, through Larkspur the way it always moved, seeping under doors, and through propped open windows, and by full dark Harlan Voss knew, with a cold certainty, that had nothing left in it of his old easy smile, that the ground under his whole careful scheme had just begun, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. He did not come to the store that night. He sent Pute instead, and 2 other men Joe didn't recognize, and they came not through the front door, but around the back in the deep hour, after midnight when even the silver rail had gone dark and quiet. Jo woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and into the store before she'd fully finished waking, and found the little storage shed behind the building already fully alight, flames climbing hungry and orange into the black sky, throwing wild shifting light across the yard, where 3 men on horseback sat watching, unhurried, the way you'd watch any job you were confident nobody could stop in time. Fire! Jo's voice tore raw out of her throat, loud enough to wake half the street. Fire! Somebody, help! Fire! The riders wheeled their horses and were gone into the dark before the first neighbor's lamp came on, before Purdy came stumbling out in his nightshirt with a bucket, before Nate came running full out from the boarding house 3 streets over, boots half-laced, having heard the shout carry clean across town on the still night air. They saved the store. Barely. A bucket line formed fast, the whole street turning out in nightclothes to pass water hand over hand, Purdy in his nightshirt, Mrs. Alden with her hair still in its nighttime braid, even Mabel Pruitt, of all people, standing in the line passing buckets, with a grim, silent determination that Jo would remember, later, longer than she remembered the fire itself. By the time the flames finally guttered down to smoking char, the shed itself was a ruin, roof caved in, walls collapsed inward, into a black skeleton of timber, but the main building stood untouched, scorched along one back wall and nothing worse. Jo stood in the wreckage of the yard, as the gray light of dawn came up, over what was left, soot on her hands, on her face, in the very roots of her hair, and looked at the still smoking timbers of the shed, where a month's worth of stock had gone up in a single hungry hour. Sacks of flour and grain reduced to ash, barrels of nails warped and blackened. Everything she'd spent 11 years building, patiently, one careful shelf at a time, and a single midnight hour had taken a bite clean out of it, deep enough to hurt for a long, while yet however much worse it might have been. Nate stood beside her, breathing hard, one hand still black, with ash from the bucket line, a shallow burn already rising red along the back of his other wrist, where a falling timber had caught him. "You're hurt?" Jo said, reaching for his hand, before she'd quite decided to. "It's nothing. Let me see it." He let her turn his wrist, over in the gray morning light, and she looked at the burn a long moment, and found her hands, steady through every single terrible thing that had happened this past week, were shaking now, just slightly, now that the danger itself had finally passed. "That wasn't a threat anymore," Nate said quietly, watching her inspect the burn rather than watching the smoking ruin behind them. "That was a message. He knows we're close to something, and he's telling us, plain as anything he could have said out loud, that he'd rather burn this whole place to the ground than let it slip through his hands now." "Then he's about to learn," Jo said, and her voice, for the first time, since the fire started, did not shake at all, even as her hands still did. "Exactly how much it costs a man to burn something that was never his to burn in the first place." Thomas arrived at a hobbling half-run just as the last of the smoke was thinning to gray wisps against the brightening sky. His cane forgotten somewhere behind him, his nightshirt still tucked haphazard into a pair of trousers pulled on in the dark. "Jo." His voice cracked, with something closer to terror than she'd heard from him even the day he confessed the note. "Jo, are you?" "I'm fine, Papa. We're both fine. The shed's lost, but the store's standing." He reached her, breathing hard, and pulled her into an embrace with an old man's desperate strength, and over his shoulder Jo caught Nate's eye, and something passed between them, relief and grief, and a grim shared understanding that whatever peace Thomas's release had bought them the day before, it had bought them exactly one day and no more. "I was released not 18 hours past," Thomas said, pulling back, his eyes moving over the wreckage with a stricken, disbelieving look. 18 hours, Jo, and already He stopped himself, straightened with visible effort, some of the old steel Jo remembered from her childhood coming back into his spine. "No, I'll not let this frighten me back into silence. Not again. Whatever he intends next, he'll find this family considerably harder to break than he's counting on." "That's the truest thing you've said all week, Papa," Jo said, and for the first time, since the smoke first woke her, something that might almost have been a smile found its way onto her soot-streaked face. Harlan Voss arrived a little after 7, riding in slow and easy down the main street, as though he'd only just heard the news and come to offer his neighborly concern, and the sheer gall of it, the practiced innocence sitting so comfortably on his face, was almost enough to undo the last thread of Joe's composure entirely. "Terrible thing," he said, reining up at the edge of the wreckage, surveying the ruined shed, with an expression carefully arranged into something like sympathy. "Terrible thing, a fire. You want to be more careful with your lamps, Joe. A woman running a place alone, these things happen." "3 riders," Joe said, "came around the back after midnight. I saw them plain, Harlan, same as half the street saw them riding off after. Rustlers, probably, or drifters looking to steal what they could carry, before the flames got too high. This county's full of men, with no respect for another person's property." He said it without a flicker of shame, without the smallest hesitation, and Joe understood, watching him say it, exactly how many times in his life he had told a lie this smoothly, and never once been made to answer for it. "Shame you can't prove otherwise." "I don't need to prove it to you," Joe said. "I only need to prove it to a magistrate. And you'd best hope, Harlan, that the same one currently deciding whether my father forged a deed doesn't also take an interest in who exactly benefits from a fire set behind a store 4 days before a debt comes due." Something flickered behind Harlan's easy smile, the first real crack Joe had seen in it since this whole business began, small and quickly smoothed back over, but they're all the same. "You're tired, Joe," he said, gathering his reins. "Grief does strange things to a woman's judgment. I get some rest, was I you. 16 days is closer than you think." He rode off unhurried, the same way he always rode off, like a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry toward or away from anything. Sheriff Colby arrived not long after, summoned by Purdy, and walked the ruined shed slow and thorough, crouching here and there to examine the char pattern, the scorched earth near, where the fire had clearly been set rather than accidentally sparked. "This didn't start from a lamp," Colby said, straightening, brushing ash from his knees. "Somebody laid kindling deliberate along the base there, and set it fast enough to catch, before anybody inside had cause to notice." He looked at Joe, and for the first time, since this whole business began, there was something plain and unhedged in his face, not the careful, calculating caution he'd worn in his own office, but something closer to genuine anger. "I'll not pretend I don't know who benefits from you losing this store, Miss Caro. Whether I can prove it in front of a judge is a separate matter from whether I believe it. But I'll be asking Harlan Voss where he and his men were last night, and I'll be asking it plain in front of witnesses, and I'll expect a better answer than the one he gave you this morning." "That's more than you offered a week ago, Sheriff. A week ago I hadn't watched 3 riders burn a woman's shed to the ground, over a debt that turns out never to have existed." Colby's jaw tightened. "I've been slow to see plainly in this business, Miss Caro, and slower still to say so out loud. I'm saying it now. Whatever comes of the forgery question, whatever the circuit judge decides, I don't believe your father did a single wrong thing, and I don't believe Harlan Voss is half the neighborly man this town spent years taking him for." Colby took his leave, while after, notebook filled with the char patterns and witness names he'd need for whatever came of it, and Nate stood beside Joe watching him go, jaw tight, the burn on his wrist still wrapped in the strip of clean cloth Mrs. Odell had produced from somewhere without being asked. "He's frightened," Nate said quietly, once both Harlan and the sheriff were well down the road. "Man that's certain of himself doesn't usually bother riding out at dawn to explain a fire nobody's accused him of yet. He's frightened, Joe, and a frightened man who's already burned one building doesn't often stop there." Joe looked at the smoking ruin of her shed, looked at the store standing behind it, scorched but whole, looked, finally, at the man beside her, his wrist wrapped, his face streaked with soot, who had run 3 streets in his shirt sleeves in the middle of the night, because he'd heard her voice carry on the wind, and hadn't waited a single second to ask himself why it mattered, so much that he come running. "Then we'd best make sure," she said, "that whatever he does next, it's the last thing he ever gets to do to this town, without answering for the whole of it." They stood together while longer in the wreckage, the two of them, while the rest of Larkspur slowly dispersed back toward their own homes, and their own breakfasts, the way a town always does, after the excitement of a fire finally settles, into the duller work of cleaning up after it. Purdy stayed longest, helping her father drag the last of the ruined timbers into a pile, and Mrs. Odell brought coffee for everyone still standing in the yard, and even Mabel Pruitt, on her way past, paused long enough to say she was glad the store itself had been spared. 3 words, plainly meant, the closest thing to a kindness Joe had ever heard cross that particular woman's lips. It should have felt, Joe thought, like a victory of some small sort. The debt disproven. Her father cleared, at least provisionally. A sheriff finally willing to say plainly what he believed. And yet standing there in the ash and the pale morning light, she understood with a cold, settling certainty that the fight had only just begun in earnest, that everything before this morning had been Harlan Voss testing the ground, feeling for weakness, and everything after it would be something else entirely. A man that frightened, that far past caring what the law might eventually make of him, was a man who had already decided the ordinary rules no longer applied to whatever he did next. Somewhere behind them, in the last gray hour before full sunrise, the town of Larkspur was waking up to the smell of smoke, and the sight of a woman standing straight-backed in the ashes of her own yard, and not one soul watching, yet understood that the story they thought they already knew had just, quietly and completely, turned itself over into something else entirely. In the days after the fire, the shed stood half rebuilt. Harlan Voss kept a wary distance, while Colby's investigation ran its course, and the town settled into an uneasy quiet before the note's true deadline finally came due. For days remained. Joe Caro spent them the way she'd spent every hard season of her life. Working. She swept the porch each morning at the same hour, though half the shed behind her still stood in blackened ruin. She weighed flour, counted coins, smiled, thin and businesslike, at customers who came in not for nails or coffee but for a closer look at the woman the whole county now believed was about to lose everything in public, on the courthouse steps, exactly the way this town had always secretly hoped she would. Because that was the plan now. Not Harlan's plan. Hers. "You're certain about this?" Nate said, the first evening, watching her lay the certified papers out across her counter, arranging and rearranging them the way she arranged everything, until the order satisfied something in her that plain instinct alone couldn't reach. "I've never been more certain of anything. We could take it to Colby quiet. Tonight even. End it without the courthouse at all. And let the town go right on believing what it's always believed. That I got lucky. That some stranger rode in and saved poor Thomas Caro, difficult girl, from a mess she couldn't manage on her own." Joe shook her head once, firm. "No. If I settle this quiet, Harlan walks away with nothing worse than embarrassment, and the water scheme sits in his back pocket for whatever poor family he tries it on next. This town needs to watch itself almost cheer for a thief. That's the only cure for a town that spent 30 years being easy to fool. And if it goes wrong, if he's got some card left we haven't seen, then we'll have played it in front of witnesses instead of alone in a dark room. I'll take those odds." She squared the last paper, edge to edge. "I've spent 8 years letting this town decide who I am, without ever once making them look at the truth of it up close. I'm done letting that happen quiet. Whatever this costs, Nate, it happens in the light where nobody gets to look away from it after." Nate watched her a long moment, something working behind his eyes, that looked, she thought, almost like pride, though he'd never once used that particular word on her. "All right," he said. "Then we do it your way, every step of it." She told her father the plan the next morning, over coffee neither of them touched, and watched fear move across his weathered face, before something steadier settled in behind it. "In front of the whole town," Thomas said slowly. "That's a great deal to risk, Joe, on one afternoon going exactly right." "It's a great deal to risk," she agreed. "But I've spent 4 years watching you carry a shame that was never yours to carry, Papa, because you were too frightened to say it out loud, where anybody could hear it and help you carry it instead. I'm not making that same mistake. Whatever happens on those steps, this town is going to hear the truth of it, whole in the light, where nobody gets to pretend afterward they never knew." Thomas was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slow between his hands. "Your mother would have been proud of you," he said finally. "I don't say that near often enough. I'm saying it now before we walk into whatever comes next, so you'll have heard it plain, regardless of how the day goes. Nothing's going to go wrong, Papa." "No," he said, and something almost like his old, steady self came back into his voice. "No, I don't suppose it will. Not with you standing at the center of it." Harlan Voss came to gloat every single one of those 4 days, right on schedule, and Joe let him. That was the hardest acting of her life, standing behind her own counter, while the man who tried to burn her out, tried to jail her father, tried to steal a woman's whole life for the price of a lie, leaned in close and told her, almost tender with it, exactly how he intended to finish her. "You've got sand, Joe, I'll give you that," he said the first afternoon, turning a can of peaches in his hand the way his cousin Roy always had, on purpose, the same small insult passed down like a family trait. Most women would have folded by now, cried on somebody's shoulder, begged. He set the can down, crooked, and left it that way. "You're going to stand up there on those steps in front of the whole county and lose everything anyway." I almost admire the stubbornness of it. "Almost," Joe repeated, flat. "Almost." He smiled. "There's still time to change your mind. Sign quiet, keep some dignity." "I'll think on it." He left satisfied. She reshelved the peaches the second the bell went still, squared them, even, the way she squared everything, and told herself the trembling in her own hands afterward was only tiredness. Nothing more, though she knew better, and let herself know it anyway, alone where nobody could see. He came again the second day, and the third, each time a little more pleased with himself, a little less careful with what he let slip in his own satisfaction. The exact kind of carelessness Joe had been counting on, since the moment she decided to let him keep believing he'd already won. "Sign quiet," he said on the second to last day, "and save yourself the courthouse. Offer's still open, Joe. There's a kind of mercy in it even now." "I'll think on it," Joe said, small, and let her hands tremble, just slightly, just enough for him to see. He smiled the whole ride home, she imagined. She hated giving him that particular pleasure. She gave it to him anyway because a bully fed on fear tended to grow careless, and careless was exactly what she needed him to be when the last day finally arrived. The last day of the month came pale and clear, and Harlan Voss made certain the whole town came with it. He'd wanted an audience. From the start, that was the tell in him, the thing that gave away the truth underneath the greed. A man collecting a debt does it quiet, in a lawyer's office with a signature and a handshake and nothing more. A man teaching a lesson does it loud, in the open, where everybody gets to watch. Harlan had spent a week spreading word, through Larkspur, that the Caro business would be settled on the courthouse steps at noon, and by 11:30 the whole street stood crowded, with people who'd come, most of them, to see a woman finally answer for the sin of being too much for this town to hold. Joe dressed slow that morning in the same plain dress she wore any ordinary day, because she'd decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, that she would not give this town the satisfaction of watching her dress for battle. Let them see her exactly as she was. That, more than anything else she could have worn, felt like the truest kind of armor. Her hands did not shake, folding the last paper into the portfolio. She noticed that, distantly, the way you notice weather finally clearing, after a long hard rain. She walked to the courthouse on Nate's arm, and felt every eye on the street turn to watch and let them. In her free hand she carried the leather portfolio, squared to the edges, and inside it, in careful order, sat everything that mattered, the certified Millbrook records, the receipt from her mother's Bible, and one thing more added only the night before that not even Nate knew the whole of yet. Thomas walked on her other side, upright. No cane, he'd left it home on purpose, and Joe hadn't argued, because she understood a man wanting to stand straight on the day his family's shame finally got answered. Mrs. Odell stood near the front of the crowd, as they passed, and gave Joe a small, steady nod, the kind that asked for nothing back. Purdy stood a little further on, hat already off his head, though the sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to warrant it. Even Reverend Whitfield had arrived early, waiting near the courthouse steps, with a leather Bible of his own tucked under one arm, and something in the set of his shoulders told Joe he understood exactly what role he'd been asked to play today, and had come ready to play it without flinching. "They're all here," Nate said low, scanning the crowd. "Whole town." "Good," Joe said. "I need them all." Harlan stood at the top of the courthouse steps like a man at his own coronation. His forged note in one hand, his cousin Roy a half step behind him, and beside Roy a thin man in a black coat Joe didn't recognize, a lawyer, brought up from Millbrook, who kept checking his watch like the whole business was already decided, and he simply wanted to get home. "Breathe. Just breathe. You've done harder arithmetic than this." Except this wasn't arithmetic. Except numbers had never once needed her voice to hold steady in front of 60 watching faces. Except, "Stop. Stop that. You practiced this. You know every word of it." She didn't, not the parts that mattered most, the parts that depended on Harlan saying exactly what she expected him to say, in exactly the order she needed him to say it. But there was no undoing this now. There was only the portfolio in her hand, and the crowd waiting, and one single door left to walk through. She walked through it. "Joe Caro." Harlan's voice carried loud. Over the crowd. "Practiced. Theatrical. Didn't think you'd show. Figured you might have run in the night. But here you are." He held up the note. "This comes due today. $700, signed by your father to mine, and everybody here knows you can't pay it. So I'm calling it legal and proper. Unless," the mercy smile again, wide and terrible, "you want to reconsider here in front of everybody. Sign quiet. Keep your dignity." The crowd murmured. This was the moment they'd come for. Stay calm, Joe told herself. Don't rush it. Let him talk himself further out onto the ice before you break it under him. "That's a generous offer, Harlan," she said. "For a man collecting a debt, that isn't real. It's real enough." "Is it?" She tilted her head, the way she did when a customer tried shorting her at the counter. Funny thing about real debts. They usually come with a number that doesn't change depending who's asking. Yours has grown some, hasn't it, since the first day you mentioned it to my father. Numbers don't grow, Joe. You'd know that running your books. I do know that. Something in her voice sharpened, just slightly, the first crack of the weapon she'd been sharpening for a solid month. Which is exactly why I find it strange that a debt my father remembers, as one figure has turned, in your mouth, into something else entirely. Joe let the silence stretch. She'd learned the weight of a held silence, from Harlan himself, watching him use it across her own counter for a solid month. And now she turned the weapon back on its owner. "Before I decide anything," she said, voice carrying clear to the back of the crowd, "I want the number said plain in front of all these witnesses." "How much, Harlan? Say it exact." $700. You know it is. Signed and witnessed by whom? Something flickered in his jaw. Just a hair. Because he'd never once had a witness on that note, and now a woman was asking about witnesses on the courthouse steps, with a Millbrook lawyer standing close enough to hear every word. "It's my father's note," Harlan said. "Doesn't need any witness." "All right." Joe nodded slow, like she was simply getting the record straight. She turned to the crowd. "You all heard him. $700. No witness. Due today. Remember that number." Then she opened the portfolio. "I'd like to introduce a witness of my own," Joe said. "Reverend Whitfield. Would you come up, please?" A stir moved through the crowd as the Reverend stepped forward, from where he'd been waiting near the front, and something in the gathering changed instantly, because a preacher climbing those steps was a different kind of thing entirely than a debt call. This was the man who married them and buried them and stood between this town and its own conscience every single Sunday. He climbed the steps slow, deliberate, Bible tucked under one arm, though he had no need of it for what he was about to say, and stood facing the crowd, with the particular stillness of a man about to speak a truth he'd carried too long unspoken. "Reverend," Joe said, 2 years ago, were you present at Silas Voss's kitchen table?" "I was." Whitfield's voice was quiet, but it carried, the way a preacher's voice was trained to. "Silas asked me to witness a debt settled. Thomas Caro paid him $700 in full, and Silas wrote out a receipt with his own hand, and I signed it as witness. He paused, looked at Harlan, and there was no softness left in it at all. Silas told me that day he wanted a clergyman's signature because he feared his own son might one day try to collect a debt already paid. His words, not mine. I confess I let that receipt sit forgotten a full 2 years, and I am ashamed of that forgetting standing here today more than I can rightly say. That's a lie, Harlan said, but it came out thin. The Reverend's confused. That was some other. I do not confuse the Lord's own table with a lie, Mr. Voss, Whitfield said, and something in his mild face had gone hard as flint. I have sat at very few deathbeds and very few kitchen tables that I don't recall with perfect clarity. Your father's was one I remember better than most because of exactly what he feared, sitting there, about the sun standing in front of me now. The silence on the courthouse steps went total. Joe drew the receipt from the portfolio and held it up where the front rows could see it. Silas Voss's own hand. Paid in full. No further claim. Witnessed by this county's own reverend. She let them look. This isn't my word against yours, Harlan. This is your own dead father's word. The crowd's mood had begun to turn, the way a crowd turns, when the story it came to watch starts becoming an entirely different story. Now, Joe said, and her voice sharpened. Here's what I couldn't understand. You knew this debt was paid, Harlan. You kept your father's books. So why would you come at my family 2 years, after it was settled, with a made-up number, in front of the whole town? A smart man doesn't do that for spite. Even you. She turned, slow, meeting eyes across the crowd. So I asked myself what you actually wanted. And I found it. She drew the certified Millbrook papers next. No lien was ever filed against my land. Not by your father. Not by you. You never had legal claim to take this store, note or no note. But you didn't need a real claim, did you? You only needed to frighten a broke woman and a sick old man into signing quiet before anybody thought to ask why a feed store was suddenly worth so much to a man who already owns half this county. Harlan's face had gone the color of old ash. His Millbrook lawyer had stopped checking his watch entirely. There's a railroad spur coming through this county, Joe went on. It needs water. It needs flat ground close to town. And my store sits directly over the best of both. That's what you were really after, Harlan. Not a debt. Fortune. And you dressed the theft up as teaching a difficult woman a lesson, because you knew this whole town would come out and cheer you doing it instead of ever asking a single hard question. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and uneasy, the particular sound of people realizing they'd nearly been made fools of in public. Somewhere near the back, a rancher who'd sold Harlan a strip of grazing land not 3 months before turned to the man beside him and asked low whether that sale had ever felt quite right to him either. It hadn't. Word of that particular unease would travel through Larkspur before the day was through, same as everything else. Harlan's Millbrook lawyer had gone very still beside him, his earlier boredom replaced by something considerably more alert. He leaned close to Harlan, murmured something short and urgent, and took one small, deliberate step away from his client, the kind of step a careful man takes when he senses the ground under a business arrangement shifting fast beneath his feet. That was when a stranger stepped through the crowd, a heavy-set man in a traveling coat, hat in hand, introducing himself before Harlan had a chance to recover. Josiah Pratt, he said, agent for the railroad. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe this concerns my business as much as yours. He produced a folded document from his coat. Mr. Voss approached our company 2 weeks past, offering to sell a parcel of land he claimed clear title to. This parcel, in fact. He held it up, bearing the signature of one Thomas Caro. Now hold on, Harlan started, some of his old easy confidence trying to reassert itself. That's a private business matter, Mr. Pratt. Nothing to be aired out in a public. Fraud stopped being private the moment you tried committing it against my company, Pratt said, flat, unhurried. My company does its own verifying, Mr. Voss, before any money changes hands. We sent a man to Millbrook to compare that signature against the county's records, the very records this young woman appears to already be holding in that portfolio of hers. He glanced at Joe, something like respect crossing his weathered face. It doesn't match, not close, which makes this, he tapped the document, a forgery, and makes you a man who tried to sell my company land you never once owned, using another man's stolen name to do it. I can explain the discrepancy. I'd very much like to hear you try, Pratt said. In front of a judge, where explaining under oath carries considerably more weight than explaining on a courthouse step to a crowd that's already stopped believing you. Harlan's composure cracked clean through. That's a misunderstanding, Ask Roy, Joe said quietly. He already told me the truth of it days ago. Ask him to tell it again now in front of everybody, or let him stay silent, and let that silence speak for itself. Every eye turned to Roy Voss. Nate stood a step back, from Joe through all of it, close enough to reach her. If the crowd turned ugly, far enough that not one soul watching could mistake this for anything, but her fight, won by her own hand. He'd offered, the night before, to stand beside her on the steps themselves, and she told him no, gentle but certain. This part she needed to do alone, in front of everybody, so that no one afterward could say a man had done it for her. Watching her now, voice steady, spine straight, dismantling 4 years of lies one careful piece at a time in front of the whole county, he found himself thinking that he had never once, in 12 years of watching men fight for things, watched anybody fight this well. Not with fists, not with threats, with nothing but the plain, unanswerable truth, laid out in order, and the nerve to stand still, while the world finally caught up to it. He was not, he understood, watching a woman being saved. He never had been. He'd simply been the man lucky enough to be standing nearby when she did the saving herself. Roy stood very still a long moment, his cousin's whole desperate hope hanging on whatever he chose to do next. The crowd waited. Nobody breathed easy. Even Harlan had gone quiet, watching his own blood decide, in front of the entire county, whether family still meant what he'd always assumed it meant. Then Roy stepped forward, away from Harlan, toward the center of the steps where the whole town could see him do it. He forged it, Roy said, and his voice shook, but didn't stop. I watched him practice old Thomas's signature for the better part of a week, copying it off an old bill of sale from the feed store till he had it close enough to pass. I told him it had gone too far. He didn't care to hear it. He looked at Harlan, and something in his face was finally, fully done. I've held doors open for you my whole life, cousin. Told myself holding the door wasn't the same as walking through it myself. I know better now. I'm done holding this one. You take her side, Harlan said, low, venomous. Over your own blood. I'd take the truth side, Roy said. Over anybody's. Took me too long to learn the difference, but I've learned it now, standing right here in front of God and this whole town. Harlan lunged for him, one wild step, more instinct than plan, and Nate was between them, before the step finished landing, one hand flat on Harlan's chest, immovable as a fence post. That's enough, Nate said. Quiet. Absolute. Sheriff Colby came up the steps then, notebook already out, the same plain, unhedged anger in his face Joe had seen the morning after the fire. Harlan Voss, Colby said. I'm placing you under arrest. Forgery. Attempted fraud. And I expect, once we've had a proper look, arson besides. He turned to Joe, before he led Harlan away, and something in his broad, tired face had settled into a plainness she hadn't seen from him since this whole business began. Miss Caro, I owe your father an apology. I intend to give him proper, not just here in passing. I let a rich man's word carry more weight in my office than a poor man's truth, and that's not what this badge is meant to stand for. I'll not forget the lesson of it soon. See that you don't, Sheriff, Joe said. Not unkind. Just plain, the way she said everything that mattered. He nodded once and led Harlan down the steps. They took Harlan down the steps in front of the whole town, and nobody cheered the way they'd have cheered a week before, watching Joe Caro marched away instead. There was only a long, heavy silence. The silence of a town realizing how close it had come to applauding a man for robbing every family in it. The crowd broke apart slow, in twos and threes, the way a crowd does when it needs time to sit with something it isn't proud of. Joe caught pieces of it as people passed, a rancher's wife murmuring to her husband that she'd always had a bad feeling about that Voss boy, though nobody among them could recall her ever once saying so out loud before today. A young farmhand, red to the ears, admitting to a friend that he'd laughed along at every joke Harlan ever made about the Caro girl, and hadn't thought once, not one single time, to ask himself why a joke needed a woman's whole reputation as its punchline. It wasn't an apology, most of it. Not yet. But it was the beginning of the particular discomfort that comes before an apology, and Joe understood, watching the crowd disperse, that this, more than the arrest itself, more than the forged papers or the receipt, or any single piece of evidence she'd laid out, was the truest victory of the day. Not Harlan's ruin. The town's reckoning with itself. Colby's investigation into the fire moved faster than anyone expected. Once he decided to look at it plain instead of sideways. Pute broke first, 2 days after Harlan's arrest, trading a full confession for a lighter charge, admitted to setting the shed alight on Harlan's direct order, admitted the other 2 riders had been hired hands, from outside the county, paid cash and told to keep their mouths shut and ride on after. He served 8 months in the county jail and left Larkspur the day his sentence ended, and nobody, Joe included, gave much thought to where he went after. Mabel Pruitt found Joe at the bottom of the steps, hands twisting in front of her, the bright hunger gone entirely out of her face. Joe! Her hands twisted harder. I owe you an apology I don't rightly know how to make. Then don't make it small, Joe said. Not cruel. Just tired in a way that went back years. If it's just for today, keep it. That one costs you nothing. But if it's for 30 years of poor Thomas Caro, that girl of his too sharp, too much, that's the one worth saying out loud. Mabel's face crumpled. You're right. God help me, you're right. She turned to go. Stopped. Looked back. You were never too much, Joe. I think some of us always knew that. I think that's why we said it. Because you being enough, all on your own, made the rest of us feel like we weren't. She walked off, and it was, Joe thought, the most honest thing she'd ever heard the woman say. Purdy came next, hat still in his hands, working up to whatever he meant to say the way he always worked up to things, slow and careful. Wanted to say, he started, then stopped, then started again. Wanted to say, I'm sorry I never once lifted a sack for you. All these years. Wasn't my place to, I told myself. Woman's business, running her own store. Truth is I was just glad enough somebody else was doing the heavy lifting so I didn't have to feel poorly about not offering. He turned his hat once. That's a coward's arithmetic, I expect. Same as your daddy's in its own way. I'll not do the sum that way again. You showed up when it mattered, Purdy, Joe said. Sat on my father's porch the night they took him in. That's worth more than any sack you never lifted. He nodded, satisfied, and went to join the others. The town rebuilt the shed the following week, near enough the whole of Larkspur turning out, over 2 long Saturdays to do it, Purdy and the Fenwick boy hauling lumber, Mrs. Alden and Mrs. Odell organizing a noon meal big enough to feed every hand. That showed, even Reverend Whitfield taking a hammer to the framing himself, sleeves rolled, looking more at home, with the work than Joe had ever once seen him look in his own pulpit. Nobody called it charity. Nobody used that particular word at all, and Joe understood, watching them work, that the word would have been the wrong one regardless. This wasn't pity, dressed up the way pity always dressed itself in Larkspur, soft and pointed both at once. This was a town trying, in the only language it knew, hammers, lumber, a shared noon meal, to say the thing it had never once managed to say to her plain in 8 long years. We were wrong about you. We're sorry. Let us help build something back. Joe let them. She'd spent a lifetime refusing help out of a pride that had cost her, she understood now, considerably more than it had ever protected. She stood in her own yard, in the noise and the sawdust, and the good, honest noise of a community finally doing right by somebody it had failed, and found she didn't mind the help one bit. Thomas found his daughter's arm on the walk home and was quiet while before he spoke. I said a thing once, he said finally, about wishing I'd raised you smaller, to fit this town easier. His hand tightened on her arm. I need you to hear me say it wasn't true. Not really. It was never that I wished you were less, Joe. It was that I was afraid of what the world does to people who won't shrink, and I was too small a man myself to stand between you and it. So I wished the problem away instead of standing up to it. That's the coward's version. I lived it 30 years. You stood straight today, Papa, Joe said. No, Kane. In front of all of them. I did. Something in his voice steadied. Watched my own daughter stand on those steps and take apart a lie 4 years in the building, piece by piece, calm as Sunday. Watched a whole town that spent your whole life calling you too much finally see what I've known, since you were small enough to sit on my knee and correct my own arithmetic. He stopped walking a moment, turned to face her full on, his eyes wet, but his voice steady now, steadier than she'd heard it in years. You were never too much for this world, Joe. This world was too small for you. I should have told you that every single day instead of worrying you'd never find a man who could stand it. Turns out the world just needed time to grow up to your size, not the other way round. Joe felt something in her throat go tight, the particular tightness of a truth arriving decades later than it should have, but arriving all the same. Thank you, Papa, she said, simple because there wasn't a more complicated way to say a thing that large and have it still mean what it meant. Then that's the version I'll let myself remember, Thomas said, and they walked the rest of the way home in a silence that felt, for the first time in either of their memories, entirely unburdened. Joe sat alone on the porch while after her father had gone in to rest, watching the last of the afternoon light stretch long and gold across the yard, where the shed still stood half rebuilt, timber pale and new against the older, weathered boards around it. 8 years, she thought. 8 years of this town's whispers, this town's pity, this town's quiet certainty, that a woman like her would end up exactly nowhere, alone behind a counter, too much for anybody to want, and too proud to ever admit how much that particular verdict had cost her night after night, at a dark window she kept telling herself she wasn't standing at for any reason worth naming. And now the whispers had turned, however slowly, however incompletely. Now her father stood straight without his cane. Now a whole county understood the truth of a story it had been so eager to get wrong. It didn't undo the 8 years. She understood that plainly, sitting there in the fading light, no single afternoon, however triumphant, unwrote the accumulated weight of that many seasons spent defending the simple fact of her own existence. But it changed what the years meant going forward. It changed the story the next tall, sharp, difficult girl in Larkspur would grow up hearing about a woman who refused to shrink. That, Joe thought, watching the sun finally slip below the ridge, was perhaps the truest victory of the whole long ordeal. Not the store saved, though she was grateful for that beyond measure. Not even Harlan finally answering for what he'd done. But this, a future version of herself in some other girl's memory, standing tall instead of small, because Joe Caro had once, on a set of courthouse steps, refused to be anything less than exactly what she already was. Nate found her, that evening behind the counter, the store quiet, the lamp turned low, and the whole enormous weight of the day finally beginning to settle into something she could almost call peace. You did it, he said. We did it. He came and sat on the stool by the stove, her father's stool, the one he'd claimed for himself without quite meaning to, that very first evening, and turned his hat once in his hands, the old familiar habit. I keep thinking on something you said to me, he said, the night I rode out for Millbrook. You asked me why a stranger rides 40 miles for a woman he's known 5 days. I told you to ask me again when I got back. I remember. I gave you half an answer that night on the step. About my father. About wanting to be on the side that finally made something right. He looked up at her. That was true. Every word of it. But it wasn't the whole truth, and I think you knew that even then. Joe came around the counter. Sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The way they had, that morning riding back from the surveyor's stakes. Tell me the rest of it, then. The rest of it is I've spent 12 years riding, from one town to the next, never once staying long enough to let a place matter to me, because staying meant risking watching it get taken away, same as everything else I'd ever loved got taken. His voice had gone low, careful, the voice of a man laying down something fragile. Then I rode into Larkspur, watched a woman scoop feed by eye and hit the scale dead on first try. And something in me that had been riding 12 years just stopped, decided this was the place. Not because of the town, because of you. Nate, I carried some paper 80 miles, he said. You built the rest of it with your own 2 hands. I told you once I came here looking for something real, Joe. I found it. I've known it a while now. I just wasn't sure it was mine to say out loud yet. Not while your father was sitting under a magistrate's shadow, and a fire was still smoking behind your own store. Didn't want you ever wondering if it was gratitude talking instead of just me. Say it now, Joe said. There's nothing left standing between us. You said that yourself. Say it now. You were never too much, he said, quiet, just for her. The same words he'd said standing in her doorway on a night that felt like a lifetime ago now. You just hadn't met anybody big enough yet to understand exactly what he was looking at. I understood it that very first afternoon watching you scoop corn, and I've understood it a little more every single day since. He reached over, careful, and took her hand, the one still faintly stained, with the ink of a portfolio full of truth. I'm not asking you to be anything less than exactly what you are, Joe Caro. I never once wanted that. I'm only asking if there's room, somewhere in the whole of what you are, for a man who's finally done running. Joe Caro, who had spent 8 years building a wall out of not needing anybody, and every single year of it telling herself the wall was the whole of who she was, sat with his hand in hers a long moment, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight since she was 15 years old finally, fully unclench. There's room, she said. You're certain. I've never been more certain of anything. She almost laughed, hearing her own words, from 4 days, before come back around to mean something entirely different now. I built that wall to keep out men who wanted me smaller, Nate. Not men who wanted to stand beside me exactly the size I already was. I think I always knew the difference. I just never once had cause to test it, until you rode into my store and bought 20 pounds of oats, and told me I ran the place better than 3 men who didn't half care. Best money I ever spent. It was $1.10. Best $1.10 I ever spent then. And there, finally, was the smile she'd been waiting weeks to see cross his whole face at once. Unguarded, easy. Nothing held back behind it anymore. She reached across her own counter, the counter that had held 8 years of this town's judgment, and 1 month of a fight that had nearly cost her everything, and now, at the end of it, held nothing at all except the 2 of them and a lamp burning low, and took his face in both her strong hands and kissed him and did not pull back first, the way she always pulled back first, the way a woman does who spent a whole lifetime protecting herself from wanting anything too much. She let herself finally want this exactly as much as she did. The circuit judge arrived in Larkspur 2 weeks later on schedule and closed the forgery matter against Thomas Caro in less time than it took most folks to order a meal at the boarding house. A formality by then, the whole county already having heard in exhaustive detail exactly how that particular thread of the story had unraveled. He offered Thomas a brief, formal apology on behalf of the court, which Thomas accepted with a quiet dignity that made Joe prouder of him than almost anything else in the whole long ordeal. Harlan Voss stood trial the following spring, on charges enough to fill 2 full pages of the judge's docket, and was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for forgery and attempted fraud, with the arson charge added on once Pute's confession was entered into evidence proper. He never once, in the whole of the proceedings, looked at Joe directly, and she found she did not need him to. They kept the store. Joe's name stayed on it, and Nate's stayed on nothing, exactly as he'd promised, and she kept her own ledger till the end of her days, and he never once asked to look at it. They married that autumn in the same small church where Reverend Whitfield had spent 30 years marrying and burying the people of Larkspur, and where he now stood, Bible in hand, to marry the one couple in his whole career. He told them privately afterward that he'd found himself hoping for, before either of them had ever once said the word out loud to him. It was not a grand affair. Jo wore a dress the color of good wheat, plain and well-made, because she'd never once in her life cared for lace she couldn't work in, and Nate stood at the front in the same coat he'd worn the day he first rode into town, brushed clean of trail dust for the occasion, the only concession to formality either of them made. Thomas walked her down the short aisle without his cane, upright, and did not weep this time, though something in his weathered face came very close. The whole town came. Mabel Pruitt cried openly, which surprised absolutely everyone including Mabel herself. Purdy stood near the back in his one good coat. Sheriff Colby came, off duty, and Roy Voss came too, quiet, near the door, having stayed on in the county despite everything, working an honest wage at the livery, and slowly, patiently over the following years, rebuilding whatever a man rebuilds, after he's finally chosen truth over blood. Mrs. Fenwick came down, from the boarding house specially for the occasion, seated herself near the front, and caught Joe's eye just before the ceremony began, with a look of plain, unhidden satisfaction. Told him that first morning he'd found himself a good woman, she said afterward, at the small gathering held in the store itself once the shelves had been cleared back for the occasion. Watched him push a plate of eggs round, and round without eating a single bite of it, thinking on you not 2 days after he'd met you. Never seen a man so thoroughly undone by a woman who'd only sold him a tin of coffee. She patted Joe's arm, satisfied as a woman who'd called a thing correctly, and lived to say so. Knew it then. Told my own sister so in a letter that very week. You might have mentioned it to me, Joe said, laughing despite herself. Wasn't my place, Mrs. Fenwick said. Some things a person's got to arrive at on her own, in her own time. I found they hold considerably better that way once they finally do arrive. Do you take this man, Reverend Whitfield asked, to stand beside, not above nor beneath, for the whole of your days? I do, Joe said, and there was nothing small in the saying of it. And do you, Whitfield asked, turning to Nate, take this woman exactly as she is, asking nothing of her, that would make her smaller than the whole of what she already is? Nate looked at Joe a long moment before he answered, the whole church watching, and something in his weathered, steady face made even Mabel Pruitt, 3 pews back, press a handkerchief hard against her eyes. I do, he said. I've never once wanted her any other way. There was no grander vow spoken. That day, no flowery language borrowed from some other couple's wedding, and Joe found she wouldn't have wanted one. Plain words, meant entirely, had always been worth more to her than pretty ones, and Nate Ashford had never once in the whole of their courtship given her reason to expect anything less. That winter, Nate wrote his mother the first letter he'd sent her in 12 years of writing, told her plain that he'd finally stopped, and that he thought, at long last, he understood what his father had been trying to build all those years ago, before a banker's greed took it from him. She came to see Larkspur for herself the following autumn, and returned most years after, for as long as her health allowed the traveling, and Nate came home, from that particular grief, when it finally arrived, not broken by it, but settled by it, the particular settling of a man, who has closed a door he'd spent his whole life leaving open behind him. The railroad came through the following spring, and the town well stayed the towns. Joe saw to that in writing water rights held in trust for every family in Larkspur, so no man could ever again try to steal from the ground what belonged to everyone standing on it. Harlan Voss was gone by then, ahead of the county's questions, his share of the family land sold off to answer for what the courts decided he owed. Nobody spoke his name much. There wasn't a great deal left worth saying. The store thrived. Joe added a second room the following year, and then a third the year after that, and the shelves she kept stocked and squared morning after morning, fed half the county, through 2 hard winters and 1 good harvest that made up for both. Nate worked beside her every single day, and never once, in all the years that followed, tried to put his name where hers belonged, or his hand on a ledger she hadn't offered to show him herself. He built new shelving along the back wall the spring, after the wedding, sturdier than anything the shed had held before, and Joe watched him work with the particular satisfaction of a woman who no longer had to lift every board herself, not because she couldn't, but because she'd finally learned there was no shame in a shared weight, and considerable comfort in it besides. Some mornings she still hauled the 100-pound sacks alone, out of habit more than necessity, and Nate had long since learned better than to offer unless she asked. Other mornings, without a word passing between them, he simply took the other end of whatever she was carrying, and she let him, and neither one of them made anything of it at all, which was, she'd come to understand, exactly how the sharing of a life was supposed to work. Not loud, not announced, just there, steady, every single day, the way good ground is there under a person's feet whether they think to notice it or not. Roy Voss came by the store most weeks, quiet, still working the livery, still slowly rebuilding whatever a man rebuilds, after choosing truth over blood in front of his whole county. Joe never once threw his early silence back in his face, and he never once asked her not to. He simply kept showing up, steady, reliable, the kind of small constant presence that eventually, over enough years, stopped being an apology and became instead just what it looked like when a man had genuinely changed. Girls in Larkspur grew up afterward watching Joe Caro Ashford load her own wagons and read her own scale by eye and look any man in this county dead in the eye without apology. There was a girl in particular, some years on, tall for her age, sharp-tongued, already taller by 12 than half the boys in her class, already hearing the whispers start up on the boardwalk the way Joe herself had heard them once, a lifetime and a whole different life ago. Her name was Sarah Odell, granddaughter to the very woman who'd once told Joe, over a scale of sugar, that a strong woman unsettled a weak man faster than anything else on this earth. Sarah came into the store one autumn afternoon, near tears, having overheard exactly the kind of thing Joe herself had overheard 1,000 times in her own girlhood. Some boy's cruel joke, some grown woman's careless comment about how a girl, that tall, that sharp, would need to soften considerably before any man would ever look at her twice. Joe set down her ledger and came around the counter and did the one thing nobody had ever once done for her at that same age. She knelt down, looked the girl dead in the eye. "There's no such thing as too much," she said. "There's only people too small to stand next to you. You hear me? Not one of those words they're saying about you is true. Not one. You wait for the ones who are big enough to stand beside you instead of shrinking away from it. And until they come, and they will come, Sarah, I promise you that you don't shrink 1 inch to make room for anybody who isn't. Not 1 inch. You hear me?" Sarah nodded, wide-eyed, and something in her small shoulders straightened, just slightly, the way Joe's own shoulders had once refused to straighten for anyone at all, until finally, at 23 years old, they had. "How do you know?" Sarah asked, small. "How do you know they'll come?" "The ones who are big enough." Joe thought of a dusty coat in her own doorway, of a scale reading 20 pounds dead on and a man who'd noticed, of 80 miles ridden for a woman he'd known 5 days, and a wrist burned pulling water buckets in the dark, and a whole county turned right side up on a set of courthouse steps, because one person had finally refused to be small for anyone's comfort, but her own. "Because I waited," she said. 23 years, some days it felt like, and he came. He always comes, Sarah, for the ones who refuse to shrink for anybody less. You just have to be brave enough to still be standing tall when he finally does. Sarah looked past her then, toward the front window, where the store's sign still hung exactly, as it always had, plain black letters on a plain white board, unchanged since before Joe was born. "Caro," Sarah read aloud. "Not Ashford's." "Not Ashford's," Joe agreed. "Nate never once asked me to change it, and I never once wanted to. Some things aren't about the man standing beside you at all, and never were. That sign is the first thing this whole town ever handed me. That nobody, not my father, not a suitor, not a bank, not a man with a forged note and a mean smile ever once managed to take away." She stood, smoothed Sarah's hair back from her face, the way nobody had ever once smoothed her own at that age. "Remember that too," she said. "Keep your own name on whatever you build. Whoever stands beside you later, if he's the right one, he'll never once ask you to paint over it." Because Joe Caro had learned the one thing this town had spent 30 years trying to teach her the opposite of, and had learned it standing on courthouse steps, with the truth in her own 2 hands, and a good man waiting at the edge of the crowd for her to win it herself. The world will always try to tell a strong woman she is too much, and the world will always be lying.